you got me? Come here.
Welcome to the Cine Flux, the place where we do not just watch films, we sit inside them. We ask what they are made of beneath the surface. We ask what they were reaching for, even when they stumbled. And today we are stepping into a film that I believe deserves far more of that kind of attention than it has received. A film that arrived in 2002 and was largely categorized as a sequel, as a genre piece, as a comic book action film, and therefore quietly shelved in most serious conversations about cinema. A film I have returned to multiple times now, and each time I find something I missed before. Something in the texture of a frame, something in the way a character holds a silence, something in the specific shade of red that Del Toro chose for a particular scene. Tonight we are talking about Blade 2. Get comfortable, Blade 2. Get comfortable. This is going to be a long one. And I mean that as a promise, not a warning. There is an image I want you to hold at the start of this conversation, not a scene from the film, exactly, more a sensation. Imagine standing at the edge of a body of water at night. The surface is completely still. You know, rationally, that there is something beneath it. You cannot see it, but you can feel it. That pressure of something alive and patient just below what is visible. That is what the opening of Blade 2 feels like. Del Toro does not ease you in. He does not warm you up. He plunges you into cold water and trusts you to find your footing in the dark. And there is something thrilling about a film that trusts you that completely from its very first frames. A film that says, I am not going to explain myself to you, I am going to show you, and you are either with me or you are not. What this film understands from its very first image is that atmosphere is not decoration, it is argument, it is meaning, and that understanding shapes everything that follows. So let us begin there at the beginning and work our way through the whole thing. Blade 2 was released on March 22, directed by Guillermo del Toro and written by David S. Goya, who also wrote the first Blade film. It stars Wesley Snipes returning as the half-human, half-vampire daywalker known as Blade, alongside Christopherson reprising his role as Whistler, and a remarkable ensemble of new characters including Ron Perlman, Leonorella, Norman Reedus, and Luke Goss in a role I want to spend a great deal of time on, because I think it is one of the most underappreciated performances in early 2000s genre. The film exists in that particular cinematic universe built from the Marvel Comics character, a world where vampires are not romanticized gothic nobles or sparkly young lovers. They are organized, hierarchical, ancient, and utterly brutal. They have their own class structures, their own politics, their own internal tensions. Blade, a man who carries vampire strengths without their weaknesses thanks to a bite his mother received while pregnant with him, functions as a kind of permanent insurgent in this world, neither fully human nor fully vampire. Accepted by neither side, belonging to the war itself, perhaps more than to any faction within it. What kind of story is this at its heart? That is where it gets interesting, because on the surface, yes, this is an action film, a sequel, a franchise entry. It has choreographed fights and practical gore and stylized cinematography and all the things you expect from that category. But what Del Toro does with that surface, what he builds beneath it, is something else entirely. This is a film about the ethics of alliance, about what it costs to walk alongside your enemy, about whether the monster inside you can ever truly be pointed outward toward something that deserves it, about the loneliness of being a border creature, something that exists between categories belonging to none of them. That is a rich set of questions, and Del Toro is exactly the filmmaker to ask them because he has spent his entire career fascinated by monsters, not frightened by them, fascinated by them. In Del Toro's universe, the monster is frequently more honest than the human, more pure in its balance perhaps, but also more pure in its love. He sees beauty in aberration, grace in the grotesque, and bringing him to a story that was always at its core about a man who is himself a kind of monster. Well, that is a piece of casting as meaningful as any actor he put in a role. But before we get to what the film achieves, let me tell you about the first time I sat with it. I want to be honest with you about this. When I first came to Blade 2, I had certain expectations. I had seen the first Blade film, which I found enjoyable, a solidly crafted, stylish piece of late 90s action cinema with a magnetic centered performance from Snipes. But it was not a film that had stayed with me in any deep way. It was not a film I thought about between viewings. So, when I sat down with the sequel, I came in expecting more of the same. More of the warehouse fights, more of the trench coat, more of the signature Snipes school that had made the first film work. What I was not expecting was Guillermo del Toro. I do not mean that as a cliche. I mean that in the most literal sense, I was not prepared for how completely Del Toro's sensibility had taken possession of this material. From the opening shot, there is something different in the air. The color palette is richer, more saturated, more deliberately composed. The camera moves with a kind of unhurried confidence, finding angles that a purely functional action filmmaker would not have thought to look for. The shadows are used not just as visual texture but as narrative, as things that carry meaning, that suggest something about the inner life of the world being depicted. And then there is the sound design. The way this film uses sound design, the way this film uses sound before any significant action even begins. There is a stillness in the early sequences that feels almost meditative, punctuated by organic, slightly unsettling sounds that put you on edge in a way you cannot quite name. I remember sitting there in those opening minutes and feeling for the first time that this was not going to be what I expected. There was something genuinely alive here, something that wanted to be more than it was supposed to be. That feeling, that sense of encountering something with genuine ambition in a place where you expected only competence, is one of the great pleasures of cinema, and I carry it still from that first viewing. Here is the thing about this film's story. It begins with a re-entry, not an origin. We are dropped back into Blades, where 18 months after the events of the first film, and the first thing Del Toro is restore something the previous film had taken away. He gives Blade back his mentor, his father figure, Abraham Whistler, played by Christopherson, who was seemingly killed at the end of Blade. The opening sequence reveals that Whistler was not killed but turned, converted into a vampire and kept alive in an ongoing state of forced transformation, and Blade has spent 18 months tracking him down. This is a quietly beautiful choice actually, because it tells you immediately what kind of sequel this is going to be. It is not simply going to continue the war, it is going to interrogate the personal cost of that war. It is going to ask what it means to rescue someone who may no longer be entirely the person you loved. The Simmer blade injects Whistler with a cure. A massive, almost brutal syringe is filmed with an intimacy that feels earned, not manufactured. These two men have history. The violence of the cure carries both urgency and tenderness, and Del Toro lingers on it just long enough to let you feel that complexity before the film moves forward. From there, we are introduced to a new crisis, a new enemy that is not the conventional vampire hierarchy Blade has been fighting. Something that has mutated, evolved beyond the original strain of vampirism into something far more dangerous and far harder to categorize. The vampire elders approach Blade with an alliance, a truce more precisely, asking him to join a hand-picked team of their own warriors, the Blood Pack, in hunting this new threat. A threat that does not distinguish between human and vampire when it feeds. A threat that in a sense has made the old war irrelevant. Think about what that means for a moment. Blade, whose entire existence has been defined by opposition, whose body itself is built around the act of fighting, is being asked to stop fighting his enemy and fight alongside them. He is being asked to hold this war in suspension, to sit across a table from the people who represent everything he was made to destroy, and to find a common purpose. And the film is deeply interested in that tension, in the way that necessity can create a temporary bridge between histories of profound violence, in whether trust can exist without the precondition of safety. The Blood Pack is a group worth lingering on because Del Toro fills it with characters who are in some ways more interesting than the plot requires them to be. There is Nissa, the daughter of the vampire elder who has arranged their alliance, played by Leonor Villa with a quiet, watchful intelligence that makes her one of the film's most compelling presences. There is Reinhardt, played by Ron Bellman, with a gleeful, barely contained menace that is enormously entertaining. There are others, each with their own textures, their own relationships to the mission, their own sense of what this temperate partnership means. Del Toro takes the time to let these characters breathe even within the momentum of an action film and the action itself. Here is where the film does something genuinely remarkable for its era. Del Toro shoots the fight sequences with a combination of practical stunt work and, where necessary, early CG that he uses not as a crutch but as an extension of the physical work. The choreography has a weight to it. Even in its most stylized moments, there is a sense of genuine physicality, of bodies in real space, of impact that costs something. And the enemy at the center of it, or the Reapers as they come to be called, are designed with an imagination that goes well beyond the standard genre creature. These are beings whose biology is almost philosophical in its horror. Mouths that open in multiple directions like petals of a carnivorous flower. A feeding process that is not just violent but deeply, viscerally wrong in a way Del Toro makes sure you cannot look away from. The leapers are, in fact, one of the great creature designs of early 2000s genre, and that is not an accident. Del Toro is, at his core, a man obsessed with the biological architecture of the impossible. He has spoken at length in interviews about his belief that a monster must have its own internal logic, its own evolutionary reason for existing in the form it does. A monster that makes biological sense, however horrifying, is always more frightening than one that is simply arbitrary. Because a monster with internal logic implies a world where such logic exists, a world where the rules are simply different, not absent. As the film moves through its middle section, we begin to understand that the Reaper threat is not external but internal, that it has a source within the vampire world itself, a point of origin that forces a reckoning with the way power corrupts even its most carefully constructed hierarchies. The mystery of the Reapers becomes gradually a mystery about legacy and creation and what happens when the thing you built escapes the intention you built it with. And here is where the film shifts completely. Without giving away the turn, there is a moment in Blade 2 where the emotional ground beneath your feet simply changes, where what you thought you were watching reveals itself to be something else, where the alliances you have been building in your mind as a viewer, in your emotional investment, are reconfigured in a way that forces you to feel the cost of everything that came before. Del Toro earns this moment. He has been working toward it from the first frame, and when it arrives, it does not feel like a plot twist. It feels like a revelation, the kind that always, in retrospect, seems inevitable. That, I would argue, is the test of great storytelling, not surprise but inevitability. Not the shock of the unexpected, but the quiet recognition that this is exactly where it was always going, and that you feel it rather than simply knowing it. We will come back to all of this. There is so much more to explore. The performances, the visual language, the score, the film's place in the larger Blade story, the themes that run beneath the surface of all that gorgeous visceral action. But that is for the next part of this conversation. For now, just hold that image I asked you to carry at the beginning, the still water at night, the pressure of something alive below the surface, because that is what this film is at its core. Beautiful on the surface, dangerous below it, and absolutely worth diving into. So let us talk about what this film actually achieves. And I want to take my time here because I think this is where Blade 2 is most consistently underestimated. When people dismiss it, and some do with a confidence that I find more revealing about their relationship to genre than about the film itself, we tend to gesture at it as though its ambitions were purely technical, as though Del Toro showed up, pointed some cameras at well choreographed fights, saturated its color grade to within an inch of its life, and called it a day. That reading is not just incomplete, it is, I would argue, a failure of attention. Because what this film achieves across every layer of its craft is something that rewards the kind of sustained gender's looking that we are much more willing to give to films that arrive in more prestigious packaging. Let us begin with performance. And let us begin specifically with Wesley Snipes, because Snipes as Blade is one of those cases where an actor and a role have become so fused in the cultural imagination that we sometimes forget to actually look at what the actor is doing. We see the character, the coat, the sword, the sunglasses, the voice, and we take the performance as a given. But that is a mistake, because what Snipes does in Blade 2 is considerably more nuanced than the icon allows us to notice. Here is the thing about playing a character who is defined almost entirely by control, by stillness, by the management of an interior that is perpetually threatening to become something monstrous. That is not an easy performance to give. The temptation, the easy version of this role, is to play the coolness as vacancy, to let sunglasses do the work, to offer the audience a surface that is impressively composed and trust that the action sequences will supply the emotion. Snipes does not do that. He plays the coolness as ghost, as a continuous, effortful suppression of something that is always pushing upward. And the moments when that suppression slips, when you catch something in his eyes, something behind the controlled expression, those are the moments that make Blade a genuinely interesting character rather than simply a striking image. There is a scene in this film, and I want to be careful here about which details I reveal, where Blade is placed in a position of genuine vulnerability, not physical vulnerability but emotional, where something he has allowed himself to feel is used against him in a way that is both brutal and, in the logic of the film's world, entirely predictable. And Snipes plays that scene with a rawness that I find remarkable, precisely because it comes from an actor whose whole performance style is built around suppression. The rawness is not telegraphed, it does not announce itself. It is simply there suddenly in the way he holds his body, a slight collapse in the architecture of composure that tells you everything about the cost of caring in a world that punishes care. That is the scene I keep returning to. That is the moment that proves this performance is doing something real. But I want to spend equal time on Lucas because I think his work in this film is one of the great underappreciated performances in the genre cinema of that era. Lucas plays Jared Nomak, the primary reaper, the patient zero of this new and terrible evolution of vampirism. And what he does with that role is genuinely extraordinary. Let me explain what I mean. The easiest version of Nomak is a monster. Full stop. He is the thing that hunts. the thing that gives, the obstacle between Blade and the resolution of the film's central conflict. And in lesser hands, with lesser direction, that is exactly what he would be, a beautifully designed creature suit with a capable physical performer inside it. But goes to something that Del Toro's script and direction support and encourage. He makes Nomak tragic, genuinely, deeply, uncomfortably tragic in a way that reframes everything you think you understand about this story. There is a quality of grief in Gauss's performance that operates beneath the violence. You see it in the way Nomak moves. There is something almost elegiac about his physicality, a kind of slow, heavy grace that suggests a man carrying a weight that has nothing to do with his physical strength. You see it in his eyes during the film's quieter moments, when Del Toro gives Gauss space to simply exist in a frame rather than act within it. There is a loneliness there, a specific loneliness, the loneliness of something that was made rather than born, that carries the intention of its creator in its own body, whether it consents to that intention or not. Think about what that means for the film's larger conversation. We will come to the themes in depth later, but for now, just hold this. Ghost makes you feel for Nomak, not sympathize with his violence, not endorse what he does, but feel for the fundamental injustice of what he is. And a film that can make you genuinely mourn its antagonist, that can make you feel his death as a loss as well as a resolution, is doing something that most action films do not even attempt. Ron Perlman, meanwhile, does something entirely different and equally valuable. As Reinhardt, the most aggressively hostile member of the Blood Pack, the vampire who makes absolutely no pretense of acceptance toward Blade, who performs his resentment of the Alliance with a kind of swagger that is enormously entertaining, Perlman brings the film's most purely kinetic energy. He's funny in the way that genuinely dangerous things are sometimes funny. His line readings carry a contemptuous wit that keeps the film from ever becoming too somber in its middle section. And Perlman, with his particular physicality, that massive mobile face, that body that seems built for something beyond ordinary human purposes, is particularly cast for a world where the boundary between human and monster is precisely what is under examination. There's a moment where Reinhardt and Blade share a scene of forced, deeply unwilling cooperation, and Perlman plays it as though every word of cooperation physically cost him something, as though each moment of working alongside Blade is a small private humiliation that he is cataloguing for future revenge. It is funny, it is also quietly menacing, and it adds a texture of genuine tension to the blood-packed sequences that the plot alone would not have generated. Leonard Varda as Nissa is perhaps the film's most internally complex performance, and also perhaps the one that has received the least attention. This is partly a structural issue. Nisha's art is one that deepens significantly in the film's second half, which means that her earlier scenes can read as relatively restrained, but that restraint is the work. Varda is playing a character who has been raised entirely within the vampire hierarchy, who has been shaped by that war's values and its silences, and who is now being forced into proximity with a being whose very existence challenges everything she was taught to believe. The way Varla plays that gradual, almost involuntary opening, the way Nissa moves from barriers to something that might be respect and then to something that might be more than that, is done in glances, in posture, in the quality of attention she gives Snipes in scenes where her character is not the narrative focus. It is background work of the highest order. It is acting that trusts the camera to find it rather than announcing itself. Now, the writing. David S. Goyer's screenplay for Blade 2 is, I think, considerably smarter than it is typically given credit for. The surface of the script is functional thrift. It knows how to construct action sequences, how to base revelations, how to manage a large ensemble without losing track of any individual thread. But what I want to point to is something beneath that functional surface, the way Goyer structures moral complicity into the story's very architecture. From the moment Blade accepts the alliance with the vampire elders, the film becomes interested in a question that is genuinely uncomfortable. What do you owe the people you have hurt in the past, or who have hurt you, when a larger threat makes your enmity temporarily irrelevant? And more than that, what does working alongside your enemy change in you? Does necessity create a kind of temporary kinship that lingers even after the necessity has passed? Can you fight alongside someone without beginning, however slightly, to understand them? And if you begin to understand them, what does that do to the war? These are not questions the screenplay explicitly poses. They are questions that the screenplay builds into the situation and then trusts the viewer to feel. The script does not editorialize. It does not pause to explain what its moral landscape means. It simply creates the conditions, the alliance, the shared danger, the slow and grudging accumulation of something that might be called mutual respect, and lets the viewer inhabit them. There is a line in the film that I find genuinely beautiful in its simplicity. It is not a famous line, it is not a moment that is typically highlighted in discussions of the film's screenplay, but it comes at a point where Blade is asked, essentially, whether the people he is working with are anything more than tools to him. And his answers spare, almost dismissive, but delivered by Snipes with a weight that the words themselves do not contain, tells you everything about the emotional architecture that the film has been quietly constructing around its action sequences. I will not quote it directly because I think you should hear it in context, in the film itself, but I will say that it is the line where I understood that Goyer had written something with more on its mind than a successful franchise sequel. The visual language of this film. This is where I could speak for a very long time, and I am going to try to be disciplined about it while still giving it the attention it deserves, because Del Toro's cinematographic choices in Blade 2 are simply extraordinary. The film was shot by Gabriel Beristain, and the collaboration between Beristain and Del Toro produced something that is, I would argue, visually among the most distinctive genre films of the early 2000s. Let me start with color. Del Toro has a relationship with color that is almost musical. He uses it the way a composer uses key, to establish emotional register and to modulate that register as the story demands. In Blade 2, the palette is built around a contrast between deep saturated greens and blues, the cold, inhuman tones that dominate the vampire world, the underground spaces, the environments of power and age, and the warmer, more human tones that appear in the film's moments of genuine connection. This is not subtle. Del Toro is not interested in subtlety of palette. He wants you to feel the difference between these registers. He wants your body to respond to the cold of the vampire world the way it would respond to actual cold. But within that broad contrast, there is a great deal of nuance. The flashback sequences, for instance, are lit and colored in a way that is neither fully cold nor fully warm. They exist in a kind of chromatic no man's land that visually reflects the film's thematic territory. These are people, if we can call them that, who are in an alliance that neither side fully endorses, in a fight that has temporarily suspended the normal categories. The caller says that before any dialogue does. And then there is red. Del Toro's use of red in this film is one of the most considered deployments of a single color I have encountered in genre cinema. Red appears rarely, and when it does, it carries meaning that goes beyond the obvious associations with blood and violence. There is a specific red that appears in a key scene involving Nessa. I will not describe the scene in detail yet, because it belongs in the spoiler section. And the quality of that red, the way it is lit, the way it fills the frame, is one of the most purely beautiful and quietly devastating images in the film. Del Toro is using color the way a painter uses color, not to describe but to feel, not to show but to mean. Three shots that stay with me. The first is early in the film, the sequence in which Blade infiltrates the vampire hive space to make initial contact. Del Toro frames this sequence with a perspective that is deliberately disorienting, using high angles and compressed space to make Blade appear simultaneously powerful and exposed, a figure of strength operating in an environment that is fundamentally hostile to his existence. The shot I am thinking of specifically holds on Blade from directly above. looking down through a vast vertical space, with the warm lone figure tiny at the bottom of a cold cathedral of architecture. It is a composition about loneliness, about the specific loneliness of someone who is always the invader, always the interloper, always the one who does not belong. The second shot is from one of the film's action sequences, a fight in a space that Del Toro lights with a combination of ultraviolet and practical orange that creates a color environment unlike anything else in the film. The fight itself is extraordinary, but what I want to point to is a single held frame within it, a moment where Del Toro pauses the kinetic flow just for a beat and holds on a composition of extraordinary formal beauty. Bodies in motion captured at the precise instant, where motion becomes sculpture. It is a reminder that Del Toro, even at his most viscerally propulsive, is always thinking about the frame as an image, as a thing that can be looked at, not just through. The third shot is the one I find hardest to describe without entering spoiler territory. I will say only that it occurs near the end of the film, and that it involves light, a particular quality of light that the Toro uses to transform what is, on the narrative level, a moment of conclusion into something that feels, visually, like a kind of benediction, like something being returned to the world. I have watched that shot perhaps a dozen times now, and each time it does something to me that I cannot fully articulate. That is the test I always use for great cinematography, not whether I can explain it, but whether I can still feel it after the explanation runs out. Now, the score. Marco Beltrami composed the score for Blade 2, and I want to be specific about what he does here because I think his work is one of the film's most underappreciated elements. Beltrami is a composer of considerable range and intelligence, and what he brings to Blade 2 is a score that operates on two distinct levels that are, fascinatingly, almost contradictory. On the surface level, the level you consciously register. The score is large, propulsive, percussive. It has the driving energy that the action sequences require, and it delivers that energy without apology. There is a way to Bedromi's percussion in this film that feels almost tribal. Ancient rhythms pushed through modern production, which is precisely right for a story about creatures who are both very old and very contemporary in their violence. But beneath that surface energy there is something quieter and considerably more interesting. Beltrami threads through the score a set of melodic ideas, some of them barely melodic at all, existing at the edge of tonality that carry the film's emotional undertow. These are not themes that announce themselves. They are ideas that drift in at the edges of scenes, that appear in the spaces between action beats, that color the quiet moments with something that the narrative is not explicitly stating. A sense of mourning, a sense of ancient unresolved grief, a quality of longing that never quite resolves into any familiar emotional category. The way the score treats silence is equally important. Del Toro and Beltrami seem to have a genuine understanding of when to let a scene breathe in its own acoustic space, when the ambient sound of an environment, or the simple quiet of two characters existing near each other, carries more emotional information than any musical underlining could. There are moments in this film where the score simply stops, and what fills that space is something that music would have obscured: the sound of weight, the sound of consequence, the sound of a word that does not require a score to feel real. One specific moment, there is a scene between Blade and Nissa. Again, I am being deliberately non-specific about its content for those who have not yet seen the film, where Beltrami makes a choice that I find quietly extraordinary. Rather than scoring the emotional peak of the scene with the kind of swelling orchestral statement that a less confident composer would have reached for, he simply withdraws. The scene plays in near silence, and that silence is the most emotional thing in it. Because what Del Toro and Beltrami understand, and what I think is one of the most important things any filmmaker can understand, is that music can tell an audience what to feel in a way that bypasses their own emotional response. And sometimes, in the moments that matter most, you want the audience to find the feeling themselves. You want to give them the space to feel it authentically rather than being conducted toward it. That restraint, that trust, is a form of respect. And it is something that Blade 2 demonstrates in its best moments with a consistency that I find genuinely admirable. Let me talk about craft and construction, the way the technical layers of this film serve its emotional story, because I think this is where Del Toro's vision is most completely realized. The production design of Blade 2 is the work of Carol Spear, who has been Del Toro's production designer across many of his films, and her work here creates a world that feels genuinely ancient and genuinely alive. The vampire environments in this film are not sets in the conventional sense, they are ecosystems. They have a biological quality that reflects Del Toro's fascination with the organic, with the sense that a built environment should carry the history of everything that has happened in it, should feel inhabited at a cellular level. The underground spaces of the vampire world are simultaneously architectural and anatomical. They look like the interior of something living, something with its own circulatory system, its own rhythms, its own sense of having been here long before any of the characters entered it and expecting to remain long after they had gone. The creature design, as I mentioned earlier in the context of the Reapers, is a genuine artistic achievement. Patrick Tatopoulos and his team created the Reaper design in close collaboration with Del Toro, and what they produced is a creature that manages to be simultaneously deeply unsettling and formally beautiful. The biology of the Reaper, the way its body is designed around the mechanics of a feeding process that goes beyond conventional vampirism, has the internal logic that Del Toro insists upon. But it also has a strange, terrible elegance. These are not creatures designed simply to repel. They are designed to disturb in a more complex way, to make you feel something complicated about what you're looking at, something that mixes fear with a reluctant recognition of the craft that went into their construction. The fight choreography deserves its own extended discussion. The lead choreographer on Blade 2 was Donnie Yen, and this is where I want to stop and really emphasize something. Because Donnie Yen is not simply a fight choreographer. He is one of the great martial arts talents of his generation, an artist whose understanding of screen combat is both deeply traditional and radically inventive. Bringing Yen into this film changed the entire physical language of its action sequences. What Yen brought to Blade 2 was a combination of the balletic precision of Hong Kong action cinema, the choreographic tradition of people like John Woo and Joan Whooping, with a rawness and weight that felt right for Del Toro's more grounded, more visceral aesthetic. The result is fight sequences that are, quite simply, among the best in any American genre film of that era. Not because of skill, the fights are not particularly large in terms of their production footprint, but because of quality, because of the way every movement is specific, every exchange has a logic, every body in the frame is doing something intentional. There is a fluency to the combat that you can feel even if you have no particular interest in or knowledge of martial arts. It reads as real, as earned, as the kind of violence that has a grammar and a syntax and a weight. In Del Toro shoots it with the same compositional intelligence he brings to everything else, never allowing the choreographer's technical virtuosity to overwhelm the frame, but instead finding angles and rhythms that serve both the fight's physical story and its emotional one. There is a particular sequence, the fight in the Hype Club, the film's first major set piece, that I return to when I want to show people what exceptional action filmmaking looks like. Not because it is the most elaborate fight in the film, but because of the way Del Toro uses the environment as an active element of the choreography. The space itself becomes a participant. The architecture creates possibilities and constraints that shape the movement within it. And the sequence is edited by Peter Amundsen with a rhythm that mirrors the music playing within the scene's diegetic space, so that the violence and the sound are in conversation with each other rather than simply coexisting. That kind of layered thinking, where every element of a scene is in active dialogue with every other element, is what separates craft from mere competence. And Blade 2 demonstrates it here with a confidence and clarity that takes the breath away. Now, let us be honest about where the film falls short, because it does fall short in places, and those places matter. And I think the film is best understood, most accurately appreciated, when we look at them clearly rather than glossing over them in enthusiasm for what works. The most significant issue is the ensemble. The Blood Pack is, as a concept, one of the film's richest ideas. A group of vampire warriors, each with their own history and relationship to the violence they are asked to perform, forced into an alliance with the being they were arguably designed to fight. That is an extraordinary premise for character work. Del Toro clearly knows this. He gives each member of the Blood Pack a distinct visual identity, a distinct energy, a distinct way of occupying space. And yet, for most of them, that visual distinction is all they get. The film does not have the time, or perhaps does not find the time to develop more than two or three of these characters into people we genuinely know and therefore genuinely feel something about when they are put in danger. This matters not because we need backstory. We do not backstory is not the same as character, but because the film's emotional logic depends on Blade being changed by this alliance, on his proximity to these beings shifting something in how he understands his own war. And for that to work fully, we need to feel the specific weight of each individual relationship. When we lose Blood Pack members to the Reaper threat, the narrative registers those losses, but emotionally, several of them feel abstract rather than personal. We know something terrible has happened. We feel it as information. But the few characters who are given genuine depth, Nissa Reinhardt, and to some degree the character played by Norman Reedus, who I will come back to, generate real feeling when the story puts them in danger, while the others generate primarily spectacle. This is, to be clear, not a fatal flaw. The film survives it because the characters who do receive genuine development carry more than enough emotional weight to sustain the story. But it is a genuine missed opportunity. And I think it reflects a structural tension that runs through all franchise action cinema of this period, the tension between the demands of pacing and the demands of character. Del Toro leans further toward character than most directors would in this context. But he does not lean far enough to solve the problem entirely. The second issue is the film's relationship to its own mythology. One of the things that the first Blade film established was a vampire world with rules, specific, detailed, internally consistent rules about what vampires can and cannot do, about the hierarchy of their society, about the mechanisms of their biology. Blade inherits those rules and, in some places, stretches them in ways that serve the story, but in other places, it stretches them in ways that feel less considered, where the needs of a particular action sequence or narrative beat seem to have temporarily overridden the internal logic that the world depends on. These moments are not numerous, and most viewers will not consciously register them, but they create small ruptures in the sense of a fully coherent world that is one of genre fiction's greatest pleasures, and each rupture is, in miniature, a loss. The film's pacing has one specific problem that I want to name precisely, because I think naming it precisely is more useful than a vague sense of the film occasionally dragging. The middle section. The extended sequences establishing the Black Box operations, the initial investigations into the Reaper biology, the building of the tactical situation, is occasionally repetitive in its structure. Several scenes cover similar emotional and informational ground without significantly advancing either. The film does not lose you during these moments. Del Toro's visual invention keeps the experience continuously engaging, but there is a sense, in two or three specific sequences, of time being spent rather than used, of the film marking time while it waits for its third act to arrive. This is partly a consequence of a genuine structural challenge. The film needs to establish enough about the Rebels and the Blood Pack's relationship to Blade for its third act revelations to land with full force. But the establishment, in a couple of places, tips from necessary into slightly excessive. A tighter edit, perhaps 10 or 12 minutes removed from this section, would produce a film with more unbroken momentum without losing any of the character or thematic development that makes it meaningful. Finally, there is a tonal issue in the film's use of comedy that I want to address because I think it is real, but it is also more minor than critics have sometimes suggested. The film makes periodic gestures toward humor, primarily through Reinhardt and through a couple of Blade's own one-liners that are not always perfectly calibrated to the surrounding emotional register. Del Toro is not a filmmaker whose native mode is comedy, and when the script reaches for a laugh in a moment that the film's visual and musical language has weighted toward something more serious, there can be a small but perceptible tonal lurch. These moments are brief and recoverable, but they are there, And I mention them not to diminish the film's achievement, but because I believe in looking at a film whole, its textures as well as its peaks. None of these flaws, to be clear, constitute what I would call a real wound. They are the genuine imperfections of a genuinely ambitious film, the kind of marks that are almost always present on work that is reaching for something. A film without imperfections is usually a film without ambitions, and Blade 2 has ambitions in abundance. So, how did it come to exist? What were the conditions, creative, logistical, personal, from which this particular film emerged? The story of Blade to Duction is one of those cases where the behind the scenes narrative is almost as interesting as the film itself, where understanding how it was made genuinely reshapes how you experience specific moments within it. The first thing to know is that Del Toro was not the obvious choice for this film. After the success of Blade, directed by Stephen Norrington, with a harder, more purely kinetic energy, the studio had options. They could have found a filmmaker who would deliver more of exactly what Norrington had provided, more of the same aesthetic, the same approach, the same reliable genre energy, and the film would have been fine. It would have been a competent, enjoyable franchise sequel. What they found instead was Guillermo del Toro, who at this point had directed Chronos and Nomak, two films that had established him as a filmmaker of genuine vision but had not yet demonstrated that his vision could operate at franchise scale. Del Toro came in with a very specific proposal. He did not want to make Blade 2, he wanted to make his version of Blade 2, a film that used the franchise as a vehicle for exploring the ideas that he was genuinely interested in. Ideas about the nature of monstrosity, about biological horror, about what it means to be a creature caught between categories. He came in with a visual treatment, with concept art, with a fully articulated sense of what the film should look and feel like. And what is remarkable is that the studio, to their enormous credit, said yes. The production was shot primarily in Prague, Czech Republic, and this is a fact that reshapes in the most fundamental way the texture of what you see on screen. Del Toro's choice of Prague was not arbitrary. He was drawn to the city's architecture, its combination of medieval stone, Art Nouveau ornamentation, and a specific quality of its light, which is unlike anything you find in a North American production environment. Prague gave Del Toro a built world with genuine age in it, genuine history, genuine weight. The underground spaces, the hive environments, the architectural vocabulary of the vampire world, all of this was shaped by the real city that surrounded the production. When you feel, watching the film, that the vampire world is genuinely ancient rather than constructed to seem ancient, you are responding to something real, to the presence of actual stone that has been there for centuries. Here is a fact about this production that I find genuinely fascinating and that I think reshapes how you experience the film's creature work. Del Toro insisted that the Ripper performance, specifically the physical expression of the Ripper's feeding mechanism, be done practically wherever possible, with performers in costume and prosthetics, rather than relying on digital replacement. This was a significant creative and logistical challenge. The Ripper mouth, the unfolding jaw design, that is one of the creature's most distinctive and disturbing features, required prosthetic work of extraordinary complexity, and performing in that prosthetic under the physical demands of the fight choreography was, by all accounts, genuinely brutal. The performers who wore those suits endured real physical hardship in the service of Del Toro's insistence on tactile reality. Why does this matter? Because you can feel it. When you watch a Reaper in full physical performance, particularly in a close shot where the camera is near enough to read every detail of the creature's face, there is a quality of presence that digital work of that era could not have replicated. A weight and texture and specificity that reads in your body as real rather than constructed. Del Toro understood something that is still not universally understood in genre cinema, that the audience's visceral response to a creature is partly a response to whether or not their body believes in it. And a practical performer, even in an imperfect costume, tends to generate belief in a way that early CGI, however technically accomplished, does not. There is another production fact that I find deeply revealing about Del Toro's process. During pre-production, Del Toro spent an extended period working with a biologist, not a creature designer. not a visual effects artist, but an actual working biologist, to develop the internal logic of the reaper's physiology. He wanted to understand at a functional level how a being like the reaper would actually work biologically. What would it need to eat to sustain its metabolism? How would its cardiovascular system differ from a conventional vampire's? What would the evolutionary pressure be that would produce this particular physical configuration? These questions were not directly answered in the film. The audience does not receive a biology lecture, but they shaped every creative decision about the creature's design and behavior. Because when you know how something works from the inside, that knowledge expresses itself in every external detail, even when it is never explicitly stated. It creates the sense of a creature with genuine biological integrity rather than one that simply looks good on screen. The casting of Lugos is itself a story worth telling. Gos, who was at this point primarily known as a member of the late 1980s pop duo, was not an obvious choice for a physically demanding and emotionally complex villain role in a major franchise action film. He was not an established screen actor. He did not have the profile that would typically attach to a role of this significance. Del Toro cast him because in the audition process, Cos demonstrated something that no amount of profile or experience could substitute for: a genuine emotional intelligence about the character combined with a physical presence and commitment that convinced Del Toro he could do something unexpected with the role. What Gus brought, and this is something that Del Toro has spoken about in interviews, was an instinctive understanding of Nomak's grief. Not his violence, not his physical menace, but his grief. His sense of himself as a creature that has been wronged at the deepest possible level, wronged at the level of his own creation. Kos understood that Nomak is not a villain in the conventional sense, he is a consequence. He is what happens when power operates without conscience, when the act of creation is divorced from responsibility, and that understanding produced a performance that is, at its best, genuinely heartbreaking. The relationship between Del Toro and Wesley Snipes during production is by most accounts more complicated than the finished film suggests. There were reported tensions, not uncommon in the dynamics of any major production, and particularly on genre films, where the physical demands are high and the schedules are relentless. But what is interesting about those tensions in retrospect is that they seem to have produced something useful in the film. A quality of genuine edge in Snipes' performance, a real not performed friction in some of Blade's interactions that gives the character an authenticity it might have lacked under smoother conditions. Sometimes the difficulties of making a film leave their mark on the film in ways that benefit it. This appears to be one of those cases. Norman Reedus, who plays Scud, Blade's tech support operative and the replacement for Whistler in the film's early stages, brings to his role something that is, I think, genuinely surprising the first time you see it. Reedus plays Scud with a loose improvisational energy that contrasts sharply with the controlled intensity of almost everyone else in the film. He's funny in a way that is entirely organic, that comes from character rather than from scripted humor, and his scenes with Snipes have a rhythm, a genuine, comfortable rhythm that suggests two people who know each other well, that functions as one of the film's primary sources of warmth in its first half. Reedus would, of course, go on to enormous popularity as Daryl Dixon in The Walking Dead. But watching him in Blade 2, I am struck by how much of what would become that beloved character, the roughness, the loyalty, the dark humor worn as a kind of armor, was already fully present in this earlier performance. The film's production budget was approximately $45 million, a significant increase over the first Blade's budget and reflective of the studio's confidence in the franchise's commercial viability. But what Del Toro did with that budget is noteworthy, because much of it went not into spectacle for its own sake, but into craft infrastructure, into the production design, the creature work, the choreography, the visual effects that supported practical work rather than replacing it. The result is a film that does not feel like its budget on screen in the way that many studio films do. It does not feel like money spent, it feels like vision executed, which is ultimately a far more valuable thing. One final production detail that I want to share because it has stayed with me since I first encountered it. Del Toro has spoken in various interviews over the years about the fact that he approached Blade 2 as a kind of test for himself, a deliberate exercise in proving that his particular vision of cinema, with all its predilections for the organic, the mythological, the emotionally complex, could operate within the commercial constraints of an American studio franchise. He wanted to know if he could make a Guillermo del Toro film inside a system that was not primarily organized around making Guillermo del Toro films, and the answer, as Blade 2 demonstrates, is yes. Emphatically yes, not without compromise, not without the compromise, not without the friction of those competing priorities. But yes, that knowledge that Del Toro was in part proving something to himself with this film reshapes how I experience certain moments. The moments of greatest visual and emotional ambition feel, in retrospect, like a filmmaker pushing at the edges of what was permitted, like someone operating within constraints and refusing, in certain key moments, to be constrained. And those refusals, those instances where the film exceeds what a purely commercial version of itself would have done, are for me the film's most precious things. So the film was made, it existed, and then it went out into the world, and the world responded in ways that were, depending on which part of the world you were listening to, either gratifying or frustrating or simply puzzling. Because the reception of Blade 2 is one of those cases that I find genuinely instructive about the gap that can exist between what a film is and what the culture decides to make of it. About the way that category and context shape perception in ways that have very little to do with the actual experience of watching a film on a screen in the dark. Let us talk about the numbers first, because the numbers tell a story of their own. Blade 2 opened in North America on March 22, 2002, and in its opening weekend it grossed approximately $32 million, a strong opening for a genre sequel at that time, and a clear signal that the audience for this franchise had not only retained its loyalty between films but had grown. The film went on to earn approximately $82 million in North America over its theatrical run, and when international markets are included, the global total reached somewhere in the region of $155 million against that production budget of $45 million. By any commercial measure, this was a substantial success. It was, in fact, a more profitable film relative to its budget than a great many of the prestige productions that received critical attention that same year. It validated the studio's investment in the franchise, it validated Del Toro's appointment as director, and it set the stage for the third Blade film, though that is a story for another conversation and one with a considerably less satisfying arc. But the numbers, while gratifying, do not tell you anything particularly interesting. What interests me is the texture of the reception, what critics and audiences actually said, and what the divergences between those responses reveal. The critical response to Blade 2 in 2002 was, by the standards of franchise action cinema, surprisingly positive. The film holds a certified fresh rating on Rotten Tomatoes, which, I want to be clear, I mention not because I think aggregated critical scores are a particularly sophisticated measure of a film's value, but because the existence of that positive consensus is itself a data point worth noting. Critics who engage with the film seriously, who are willing to meet it on its own terms rather than simply measuring it against the prestige productions of that moment, tended to recognize, even if they did not always articulate it fully, that there was something genuinely different happening here. That Del Toro had done something with the franchise material that went beyond competent execution. Roger Ebert, whose engagement with genre cinema was always more generous and more genuine than many of his contemporaries, gave the film a positive review that I think captured something important about what Del Toro was doing. Ebert understood that Del Toro was a filmmaker of real vision, and he responded to the film's visual ambition and its creature design with the kind of enthusiasm that a serious person brings to a serious work. He was not entirely sold on every aspect of the film. The pacing issues I described earlier were noted, but he engaged with it as an artistic object, as a made thing with intentions and ideas, rather than simply as a product to be evaluated against a checklist of genre expectations. where the critical response was less generous, and it was, in some quarters, considerably less generous. The objections tended to cluster around the film genre identity rather than its specific qualities. There is a mode of critical dismissal that dwarfs by simply refusing to take a category of film seriously, and Blade 2 encountered this mode from reviewers who were, I think, simply not interested in engaging with a vampire action film, regardless of what any specific vampire action film might actually be doing. These dismissals tell you more about the critical biases of that moment than they tell you about the film. But they shaped its reputation in ways that have been slow to correct. The audience response, interestingly, was in some ways more genuinely divided than the critical response, but divided along different lines. The core fanbase of the first Blade film, which skewed young male and deeply invested in the franchise's action identity, tended to respond with enormous enthusiasm to the film's set pieces, its creature design, and its expanded world building. They celebrated it as exactly what a sequel should be: more ambitious, more visceral, more visually inventive than its predecessor. But a subset of that same audience had reservations about the film's emotional register. They found the relationship dynamics, particularly the Blade and Nyssa thread, slower than they wanted. They found Del Toro's aesthetic occasionally more demanding than they had signed up for. And they said so in the language of online film communities in 2002, with a directness that I find both understandable and, in retrospect, a little sad, because what they were often objecting to was precisely the thing that makes the film interesting. This is a pattern I have noticed across Del Toro's genre work more broadly. His films tend to ask slightly more of their audiences than the genre label implies they will. They ask you to slow down in moments when genre convention would have you speed up. They ask you to feel things that the surface narrative does not explicitly tell you to feel. They reward a kind of attention that is not always what a genre audience has been trained to bring. And this creates consistently a subset of viewers who feel vaguely cheated, who came in for one experience and received another, and cannot always articulate why they feel unsatisfied even when the film is, by any objective measure, doing its job well and then some. The streaming life of Blade 2 is worth discussing because it represents one of the film's more interesting cultural second chapters. In the years following its theatrical release, as the film moved through home video and then into the early streaming landscape, something happened to its reputation that I find genuinely heartening. It was rediscovered, not dramatically, not with the kind of fanfare that sometimes accompanies a formal critical reappraisal, but quietly, incrementally, through the accumulation of individual viewers encountering it without the weight of its original context, without the expectation of a franchise sequel, without the critical framing of the early 2000s, without the genre prejudices that shaped its initial reception. These viewers encountered it on its own terms. They came to it, many of them, knowing only that it was a Del Toro film, because by the time the streaming rediscovery was happening, Del Toro had made Pan's Labyrinth and the Hellboy films and Pacific Rim, and his name carried a kind of artistic authority that it had not fully possessed in 2002. And encountering Blade through the lens of Del Toro's larger body of work, understanding it as part of a sustained artistic vision rather than as a franchise entry, produced a very different experience. Viewers began to see the connections, the recurring preoccupations, the way Del Toro's specific obsessions with the ethics of monstrosity, with the beauty of the grotesque, with the emotional cost of existing on the border between categories, ran through this film with the same intensity and intelligence that they ran through his more celebrated work. This is, I think, one of the most valuable things that streaming culture has done for cinema. Not the algorithmic recommendation systems or the endless availability, but the way it has enabled films to find audiences that were not available to them at their original moment of release. A film made in 2002 can now be encountered by a 20-year-old in 2024 who brings none of the cultural baggage of the original context, who simply watches it as a film and feels what it is. That freedom, that liberation from the weight of original reception, has been quietly rehabilitating films like Blade 2 for years now. As for awards, And I want to address this with some honesty because the awards landscape of this film's era is something I find genuinely frustrating when I look back at it. Blade 2 received essentially no recognition from the major American awards bodies. This is not surprising. Genre action cinema, particularly in 2002, was simply not the kind of work that the Academy Awards or their analogues were organized to recognize. The infrastructure of award recognition in American cinema has always been shaped by a set of cultural hierarchies that privilege certain kinds of seriousness: the drama of human suffering, the prestige of literary adaptation, the weight of historical subject matter over other kinds of seriousness. Genre seriousness. The kind of seriousness that asks real questions about human experience while also delivering genuine visceral entertainment. What Blade 2 deserved recognition for and did not receive is Carol Spears' production design, which is, in the most unambiguous terms, some of the finest work in American genre cinema of that decade. The coherence and imagination of the world she and Del Toro built, the way every environment carries biological and historical meaning, the specificity of the visual language she brought to the vampire world, these are achievements of genuine artistic distinction that deserve to sit alongside the recognized production design work of that year. Similarly, the creature design and practical effects work, the reconstruction, the prosthetics, the physical performance infrastructure that supported Del Toro's insistence on tactile reality, deserved the kind of recognition that the Academy's technical awards categories theoretically exist to provide, but rarely extend to horror or action genre work. Marco Bertami's score was equally overlooked and equally deserving. The work I described earlier, the layered emotional intelligence of the composition, the restraint in the film's most emotionally significant moments, the way the percussion carried both ancient rhythm and contemporary energy, is the work of a composer operating at a genuinely high level. That it went unrecognized is a comment on the Academy's relationship to genre scoring, which has always been a complicated and not entirely comfortable one. The practical choreography, Tony Yem's contribution, was, by the standards of American awards recognition, essentially invisible, which is simply a reflection of the fact that American awards culture does not have an adequate framework for recognizing the art of screen combat as an art form in the same way that, say, Hong Kong cinema has long recognized it. This is a genuine cultural blind spot, and Blade 2 is one of its casualties. What the film did receive, and what I think is in some ways more meaningful than any formal award recognition, is the sustained deepening regard of people who love cinema and who take genre seriously. The critics and filmmakers and cinephiles who have, over the 20 plus years since its release, consistently cited it when asked about underappreciated action cinema, or about Del Toro's evolution as a filmmaker, or simply about films that do more than they appear to. That ongoing regard is the kind of recognition that no awards body confers, but that no awards body can take away either. Now, where does this film sit within the larger story it is part of? The Blade franchise is, in many ways, a story about what happens when a genuinely interesting creative impulse is institutionalized. The first film, directed by Stephen Norrington from David S. Goyer's script, released in 1998, was something of a surprise. It arrived without enormous expectations and delivered something that felt genuinely fresh, a superhero action film with a hard edge, a distinctive visual personality, and a central performance that was unlike anything in the mainstream superhero landscape of that moment. It was in many ways a precursor to the era of adult-oriented superhero cinema that would eventually become the dominant mode of blockbuster filmmaking, a demonstration that you could make a Marvel-adjacent film that did not require you to soften its violence or simplify its emotional register to reach a large audience. Blade 2 arrives as the middle chapter of the three-film series, and its position as middle chapter is, and here is a thing I keep returning to, the position that best suits its particular ambitions. The first film had the work of establishment to do. It had to create a world, introduce the character, establish the rules, generate the audience that would return for a sequel. Those demands shape a film in ways that are sometimes limiting. The third film, Blade Trinity, released in 2004, directed by Goyer himself, has its own complicated story, one involving creative disagreements and the introduction of new characters that somewhat diluted the franchise's identity. But that is again a conversation for another time. Blade 2, as the middle film, is liberated from the demands of establishment. The world is built, the character is known, the rules are understood. What Del Toro can do, what he exploits with extraordinary confidence, is take all of that existing infrastructure and use it to go somewhere the first film could not have gone, somewhere deeper. Somewhere that requires the audience's existing familiarity with this world as a kind of emotional collateral, because the most powerful move Del Toro makes in this film, the turn I described at the end of the previous section, depends entirely on your investment in something that the first film built. It uses what came before not as a foundation but as an instrument of feeling. This is what the best sequels do. They do not simply continue, they transform. They take the emotional material that the original film generated in the audience and do something unexpected with it. They use your familiarity as a tool for producing responses that a standalone film could not produce. And Leto does this with an elegance and a precision that places it, I would argue, in the company of the genuinely great sequels, not as the successful ones, but the ones that justify their existence as independent artistic statements rather than simply as commercial extensions. Does Blade 2 deepen what came before? Yes, unambiguously. It deepens the world by expanding it in directions that feel organic, that feel like the natural development of ideas that were already present in the original rather than bolted on elaborations. The vampire hierarchy, which was introduced in the first film as a backdrop, becomes in the second film an active and complicated moral landscape. The question of Blade's identity, his location between human and vampire, his belonging to neither world, which the first film raised but did not fully explore, becomes in Blade 2 the film's deepest subject. The relationship between Blade and Whistler, which the first film established but left somewhat schematic, is in the sequel given the kind of emotional specificity that makes it feel genuinely weighted, genuinely at stake in a way that matters. What does Blade do art to the larger conversation of the franchise? Several things I think that are worth naming precisely. First, it introduces the idea that the vampire world is not monolithic, that within the category of vampire there are gradations, affections, internal conflicts, and that the war Blade is fighting is more complicated than a simple binary of human versus other. The Reaper storyline opens up the franchise's moral universe by suggesting that even within the world of the enemy, there are distinctions that matter, that the thing you are fighting against contains within itself further divisions, further hierarchies, further layers of injustice. This complicates Blade's war in ways that the third film unfortunately does not fully develop, but the seed is planted here with considerable intelligence. Second, Blade 2 introduces to the franchise the possibility of genuine emotional complexity in the relationship between Blade and a vampire. Then is a relationship, and I am being deliberately cautious about its specific content in this section, represents the first time in the series that a connection between Blade and a member of the vampire world is allowed to exist in a register beyond pure professional necessity or tactical alliance. There is something between Blade and Nissa that is neither adversarial nor simply cooperative, something that the film treats with genuine seriousness and without the condescension of reducing it to a familiar genre category. This expands the franchise's emotional vocabulary in a way that matters. Third, and perhaps most significantly, Blade 2 introduces Guillermo del Toro's visual and thematic language into a franchise that had previously operated in a more conventional genre register, and this introduction changes the nature of what the franchise is capable of aspiring to. Whether or not the subsequent films made use of that expanded aspiration is a separate question, but the aspiration itself, the sense that this martyr could be the vehicle for something genuinely ambitious, something with real artistic intentions, was demonstrated by Blade 2 in a way that could not be undiscovered. How does it shape what comes after? In the specific case of the franchise, the answer is complicated because the third film took the series in a direction that somewhat retreated from Del Toro's expansive vision. But in the broader context of superhero and genre cinema, the influence of Blade 2, particularly on the generation of filmmakers who encountered it in their formative years and carried its visual and thematic ideas into their own work, is more substantial than is typically recognized. You can see echoes of Del Toro's approach in the way certain contemporary genre filmmakers handle creature design, in the way color is used as emotional register in several influential genre films of the past decade, in the willingness of some action filmmakers to slow down, to let emotional weight accumulate in the spaces between kinetic sequences. These echoes are not always directly attributable, not always consciously drawn. But they are there in the texture of a generation of cinema that was made by people who had watched Blade do and felt it do something that changed what they thought was possible. Let us go deeper now. Let us talk about what this film is really saying beneath the action, beneath the genre machinery, beneath the beautiful and visceral surface. Because there is a layer of meaning in Blade 2 that I want to spend significant time with. Because I think it is the layer that most consistently goes unremarked, and it is the layer that makes the film genuinely important rather than simply genuinely good. The film is, at its deepest level, about what it means to be made rather than born. Let me sit with that for a moment before developing it, because I think the distinction is important. To be born is to arrive in the world through a process that, whatever its specific circumstances, involves the participation of forces and persons and histories that precede you. You are shaped by your origins, but your origins did not design you. There was no intention behind your specific configuration. You simply are what you are, a product of chance and biology and the particular moment of history into which you emerged. To be made is entirely different. To be made is to be designed, to carry in your very body the intention of whoever created you. To be, in the most fundamental sense, an expression of someone else's will. And this condition of having been made rather than born is what unites almost every significant character in Blade 2, and what the film is most interested in exploring. Blade was made, not born, or rather, born into a condition that was created for him, imposed on him through an act of violence against his mother, his particular biology, the combination of human and vampire that gives him his abilities and his anguish was not chosen, it was inflicted. He is what he is because of something that was done to a person he never knew before he had any existence or agency at all. He carries the consequences of that act in every cell of his body, in every moment of his life, in the specific and irreducible loneliness of being something that no taxonomy adequately describes. Nomak was made, even more literally, even more deliberately. His condition is the result of a specific act of creation, an intentional shaping, by someone in a position of power who treated the act of creation as a purely technical exercise with no moral accountability for the thing that was created. Nomak carries its creator's intention in his body as Blade carries his mother's trauma. Both of them are, in a sense, living consequences of other people's choices. Both of them are defined by something they did not choose and cannot escape. And here is where the film's thematic intelligence really begins to show itself. Because what Del Toro does, what Goyer's script enables him to do, is place these two figures, these two creatures defined by the condition of having been made, in a relationship of mutual recognition. Blade and Nomak recognize something in each other, not consciously, not explicitly. The film does not pause to spell this out, but in the quality of attention they pay each other, in the specific texture of their encounters, there is a recognition operating that goes beyond the tactical. They see in each other the same fundamental condition, the same unchosen, inescapable definition by what was done to them rather than what they chose to become. This is why Nomak is tragic rather than simply villainous. He is not the architect of his own condition, he is its victim. And his violence, his consuming, indiscriminate, evolutionary violence, is the expression of a wound that is, at its deepest level, not moral but existential. He is not evil in the way that a person who chooses evil is evil. He is a consequence that has become an agent. And that distinction, which the film maintains with considerable moral seriousness, is what prevents Blade 2 from being a simple story of good defeating evil. Think about what that means for the film's moral landscape. If Nomak is a consequence rather than a cause, if his violence is the expression of something that was done to him rather than something he chose, then the question of what constitutes justice in response to him becomes genuinely complicated. Blade's mission in every Blade film is defined by opposition. Find the enemy, destroy the enemy, prevent the enemy from destroying what remains of the human world. That mission is morally uncomplicated when the enemy is simply choosing to be monstrous. But when the enemy's monstrousness is itself a wound, when destroying the monster is also in some sense completing the act of injustice that created it, the moral clarity of the mission begins to fracture. Del Toro does not resolve this fracture. He does not offer a clean philosophical answer to the question of what Blade should feel about what he is doing. What he does is create conditions in which the question can be felt, in which the viewer experiences, at an emotional rather than intellectual level, the genuine moral weight of a story, where justice and injustice are not cleanly separable, where doing the necessary thing and doing the right thing may not be the same thing, where the categories that usually organize our moral response to action cinema, hero, villain, mission, enemy, are complicated by a recognition that the enemy is also a victim and that the victory is also in some register a loss. The theme of the made thing, the created being, runs through Del Toro's work with a consistency that amounts to an obsession. In Chronos, his debut, an ancient mechanical device fuses with its host and transforms him into something he did not choose to be. In Pan's Labyrinth, the question of whether the heroine's fantastical world is a genuine alternative reality or a psychological creation does not diminish its truth. Both a made thing and a real thing can carry the same weight of meaning. In the Hellboy films, the central character is explicitly and literally a thing that was made. A demon summoned and shaped for a purpose he spends his life refusing, and his identity is defined by the ongoing act of choosing to be something other than what he was made to be. In Pacific Rim, the Jaguar pilots are, in a sense, made things, human beings whose individuality is partially subsumed into a created system, a machine that requires them to share their deepest selves in order to function. This is Del Toro's abiding subject. Not monsters as such, but the moral and emotional condition of things that were made, things that carry the intention of their creators in their bodies and must negotiate the gap between that inherited intention and whatever authentic selfhood they can construct in the space that remains. And in Blade 2, this subject is expressed through the figures of Blade and Nomak with a clarity and an emotional depth that I think represents one of Del Toro's most fully realized explorations of the theme. There is a related theme in the film that I want to address, and it is the theme of loyalty, specifically the question of what loyalty means when the categories that usually define it have been suspended. In the world of Blade 2, loyalty is a word that carries enormous weight. The vampire world is organized around hierarchies of loyalty, to bloodlines, to houses, to the ancient structures of power that have sustained vampire civilization for centuries. Blade's word, the word of the human fighter, the hunter, is organized around different loyalties, but equally fierce ones, to the mission, to the people who support that mission, to the specific human relationships that give meaning to a life otherwise defined by violence and isolation. What the film does is take all of these loyalties and subject them to a specific pressure, the pressure of necessity. When necessity requires Blade to work alongside the people whose world he is committed to destroying, what happens to his loyalty to his own mission? When necessity requires the blood pact to accept the help of a being they were trained to fight, what happens to their loyalty to their own hierarchy? The film is interested in the way that necessity produces a kind of temporary loyalty that is genuinely felt even while being genuinely contingent. A loyalty that is real in the moment it is experienced while simultaneously being dependent on conditions that may not persist. And beneath that exploration of contingent loyalty, there is a deeper question about what loyalty means when it is offered to someone who may not deserve it or to someone whose worthiness you are not in a position to fully assess. Blade operates in Blade 2 in a state of ongoing uncertainty about who we can trust, and the film makes you feel that uncertainty as a physical condition, not just a narrative complication. There's a quality of alertness in the film, a constant low level tension in even the quieter scenes that reflect the experience of being in an alliance that you know is temporary and suspect is dangerous, of being the kind of creature for whom trust is never simply given but always calculated, always tested, always provisional. This is, I think, one of the ways in which the film resonates beyond its genre context. Because the experience of provisional trust, of working alongside people you are not certain of, in a situation defined by necessity rather than choice, is not an experience unique to half-human vampire hunters. It is an experience that many people navigate in their professional and personal lives. The film does not make this connection explicitly. It does not need to. What it does is create an emotional reality precise enough that the viewer can find their own experience within it without the film ever condescending to point that out. The symbolism and recurring imagery of Blade 2 is worth spending time with, because Del Toro is a director who thinks in symbols, not in the heavy-handed way of a filmmaker who uses imagery as illustration, but in the way of an artist who uses imagery as a primary language, one that operates simultaneously with and sometimes in advance of the narrative language. His symbols are not decorations on the story, they are part of the story's meaning. The most consistently present visual motif in Blade 2 is the threshold. Doorways, gates, portals, boundaries between spaces. These images recur throughout the film with a frequency and a deliberateness that I think goes beyond coincidence or production design default. Think about how many significant scenes take place at or near a threshold, at the edge of a space rather than within it. Think about how often characters are framed in doorways, with one world behind them and another in front of them. Think about the film's persistent interest in the liminal, in the space between categories, between identities, between the safety of what you know and the danger of what lies beyond. This is the visual language of Blade's existential condition. He is always a threshold creature. He exists at the boundary. He belongs to neither side of any door he stands in. And Del Toro makes that condition visible by placing him repeatedly and deliberately in compositions that emphasize the boundary, that keep him at the edge rather than fully inside any space. Even in moments of apparent mastery, in fight sequences where Blade is clearly the dominant force, Del Toro will often find a way to frame him at the margin of the space rather than at its center. The visual language insists on the condition even when the narrative appears to contradict it. Water is another recurring image and one that operates differently but with equal deliberateness. Water in Blade 2 is associated consistently with two things that the film treats as deeply connected: transformation and grief. The film's scenes of transformation, of bodies changing, of conditions shifting are frequently set in or near water or filmed with a quality of light that evokes the reflective, unstable quality of a water surface. And the film's scenes of grief, of loss registered, of consequence felt, often carry the same visual quality. This connection between transformation and grief is not accidental. Del Toro is saying something through these visual associations about the cost of change, about the fact that transformation in this world is never simply a gain, it is always also a loss. Something is always surrendered in the process of becoming something new. The Ripper Mouth, that extraordinary unsettling design element of the film's central creature, is, on a symbolic level, something considerably more disturbing than a standard monster feature. It is an image of consumption without satisfaction. The reaper does not simply feed, it is perpetually, constitutively hungry in a way that no amount of feeding resolves. Its biology is organized around a need, that cannot be met. And Del Toro films this detail not just as horror but as a kind of pathos, as the visible expression of a wound that cannot be healed. The Reaper's unfolding mouth is the physical form of Nomak's grief. It is the thing that was done to him made visible in his body, made undeniable, made something you cannot look away from. Think about what that means as a symbolic choice. In most creature designs, the monstrous feature is primarily frightening. It is organized around the audience's fear response, around the visual communication of danger. The Reaper mouth is frightening, yes, but it is also on reflection deeply sad. It is the mark of an injustice carried in the body, and that dual register, fear and sadness simultaneously, horror and compassion in the same frame, is what makes it one of the most conceptually sophisticated creature design elements in Del Toro's filmography. The film's use of light, particularly the specific quality of light that appears in its most emotionally significant moments, is a symbol system in itself. I touched on this earlier in the context of cinematography, but I want to return to it here because I think its symbolic significance goes beyond the technical. Del Toro uses light in Blades 2 as an indicator of humanity, or more precisely, of whatever humanity means in a world where the category is in question. The moments of genuine human connection in the film, moments where the border between human and other is temporarily dissolved by something more fundamental, something more primary than species or faction or history, are lit differently. Not dramatically differently, not with a visible signaling of significance, but with a slight warmth, a slight quality of openness that distinguishes them from the film's colder default register. This means that the film's emotional peaks, its moments of genuine connection, are literally warmer to look at than its moments of isolation or conflict. Your eye registers this before your conscious mind does. You feel the warmth before you understand that you are feeling it. And when the film moves back toward its colder register, when the warmth withdraws, you feel that as a loss, as a physical withdrawal of something the scene had offered. Del Toro is using light to manage your emotional temperature in a way that is so integrated into the visual fabric of the film that it operates almost subliminally. And that subliminal operation is, I think, one of the primary reasons why viewers often report feeling more for this film than they expected to, more genuinely moved by its emotional beats than the genre context would have predicted. Because Del Toro has been quietly working on their emotions through the film's color and light all along, building a foundation of feeling that the narrative peaks land on rather than generating from scratch. And here is what I keep returning to. When I think about all of these symbolic and thematic layers together, the film's deepest subject is the question of whether something that was made to destroy can choose to protect, whether a weapon can develop a conscience, whether a creature defined entirely by the purposes of others can, through the force of its own experience and its own choices, become something that was not in the blueprint. This is Blade's question. It has always been Blade's question, his particular, irascible, inescapable existential condition. He was made, in a sense, to be a destroyer. His biology is organized around the capacity for violence, around the ability to function in conditions that would destroy a purely human fighter. And yet, and this is the thing that makes him a character rather than simply an archetype, he has chosen to direct that capacity towards something other than pure destruction. He has chosen, in the most fundamental sense, to be more than what he was made to be. What Blade True does with that existing condition is deepen it by giving it a mirror, by presenting Blade with a figure, Nomak, who represents what he might have been if the choice had not been made or had not been possible. A being made for destruction who has been given no path toward becoming something else. A being whose relationship to his own making contains no possibility of transcendence. And in placing Blade alongside this mirror, Del Toro makes Blade's choice, his ongoing, costly, never complete choice to be more than his biology, feel newly real, newly earned, newly worthy of the weight the films have always placed on it. Now, the conversation this film started or contributed to, because it did not start it alone, is one that I find genuinely important and not always adequately recognized. Blade 2 arrived in the spring of 2002 in a very specific cultural moment. In the months following the September 11 attacks, American popular culture was navigating a complicated relationship with the idea of the enemy, with what it meant to define something as other, as monstrous, as deserving of destruction. The dominant cultural response to that moment tended toward a sharp, uncomplicated binary. There was a clear enemy, clearly evil, clearly deserving of whatever violence was necessary to eliminate it. Genre fiction, which has always been one of the primary cultural arenas in which collective anxieties about identity and otherness are processed, was under particular pressure in that moment to reinforce that binary rather than complicate it. Blade 2, arriving in this context, does something quietly countercultural. It tells a story about a hero who is asked to ally with his enemies, about the possibility that the category of enemy is not fixed, that even the most absolute opposition can be suspended by a sufficient shift in circumstances, about the way that necessity can reveal commonality where ideology had maintained difference. And it tells this story not with the kind of earnest messaging that announces itself as culturally significant, but through the specific, concrete, emotionally immediate experience of characters in a situation. It makes you feel the complication rather than arguing for it. This is, I think, one of the things that genre fiction does at its best. It processes cultural anxiety to displacement to the safe distance of the fantastic in a way that allows viewers to engage with uncomfortable ideas without the defensiveness that direct political or social content would generate. You are not being asked to think about the politics of necessary alliance in the abstract. You are being asked to watch Blade work alongside Reinhardt, to feel the specific tension of that proximity, to experience what it cost both of them and what, despite everything, it produces. And in that experience, in that emotional engagement with a situation that is both entirely fantastic and entirely recognizable, something real happens. Something changes in the viewer's relationship to the idea, not through argument, but through experience. The film also participates in a conversation about monstrosity that was, in that specific cultural moment, particularly charged. The figure of the monster in popular culture has always been a vehicle for the culture's anxieties about otherness, about what it means to be different, to exist outside the categories that the mainstream recognizes as legitimate. In 2002, in the months following an event that had produced a sharp, frightened redefinition of what constituted dangerous otherness, a film that asked you to feel genuine compassion for its monster, that made its monster a figure of pathos as much as fear, was doing something that deserved to be called courageous, even within the relatively safe space of genre fiction. Del Toro has spoken in various contexts about his belief that the monster is almost always a more honest figure than the human in popular narrative, that the monster's violence is at least direct, at least undisguised, while human violence tends to wrap itself in justification and ideology. This belief runs through all of his work, but in Blade 2 it is expressed with particular directness because the film so carefully constructs a situation in which the most morally uncomplicated violence, the institutionalized, hierarchical, purposeful violence of the vampire world, is ultimately revealed to be more destructive than the wild, undisguised violence of the Reaper. The vampire elders, with their careful plans and their ancient hierarchies and their apparently rational approach to power, have done something that the Reaper's chaos, for all its horror, could not have accomplished. They have created, in cold blood and with full intention, a being whose suffering is without limit and whose capacity for damage is exponential. The organized violence of the powerful is, the film suggests, always more dangerous than the chaotic violence of the wound. Because the organized violence has a plan. This is not a message that announces itself. It is not underlined or italicized or placed in any character's mouth as explicit statement. It is the meaning that accumulates through the film's structure, through the way its revelations are ordered, through the way its moral landscape gradually reveals itself as something considerably more complicated than it initially appeared. And a film that builds meaning in this way, that trusts its structure to do the work that lesser films would assign to dialogue or voiceover, is demonstrating a kind of storytelling intelligence that I find genuinely rare. The film's influence on subsequent genre cinema is a topic that deserves serious attention, and I want to spend some time with it because I think it is one of the ways in which Blade 2's importance is most consistently underestimated. the visual language that Del Toro developed for Blade 2. That particular combination of rich, saturated color, biological creature design, and emotionally weighted cinematography became one of the defining aesthetic templates for a generation of genre filmmakers. You can trace direct lines of visual influence from Blade 2 to subsequent vampire and creature films to certain corners of the superhero genre to the way a number of action filmmakers began to think about color as emotional register rather than simply a stylistic preference. These connections are rarely made explicit. Filmmakers do not typically cite their influences with the specificity that would make the lineage visible, but they are there in the work, in the decisions, in the particular qualities of attention that Del Toro demonstrated were possible within genre cinema. The creature design tradition that Blade 2 contributed to, the notion that a monster should have biological integrity, that it should carry within its physical form the logic of its own existence, has influenced practical effects and creature design work across the genre for the past 2 decades. The Reaper design specifically has been cited by creature designers as a template for a particular approach, the monstrous as biologically coherent, the terrifying as internally logical. This approach produces creatures that are paradoxically both more disturbing and more emotionally resonant than creatures designed purely for maximum visual impact. Because a creature with internal logic implies a world with rules, a world that plays by its own principles even when those principles are horrifying. The film's approach to action choreography, specifically the decision to bring Donnie Yen's Hong Kong martial arts sensibility into an American genre production, had an influence that, again, is difficult to quantify but genuinely perceptible in the action cinema that followed it. The aesthetic of weight combined with fluency of combat that is both technically virtuosic and physically credible, of fight sequences that maintain character psychology within the choreography, these became increasingly standard aspirations for action cinema over the decade that followed Blade 2, and the film's demonstration that this approach could work at commercial scale was part of what made it viable. More broadly, Blade 2 is one of a small number of early 2000s genre films that helped establish for a generation of filmmakers the idea that genre seriousness was not a contradiction in terms, that you could make a film within the commercial constraints of a franchise action production and still do work of genuine artistic integrity, that the genre label was not a ceiling, that ambition and entertainment were not incompatible. This is a lesson that seems obvious now, in the era of prestige genre cinema, in the era of superhero films that win cinematography awards and horror films that compete for the Palme d'Or, but it was not obvious in 2002, and films like Blade 2 were part of what made it visible. The cultural legacy of the film also includes, somewhat unexpectedly, its contribution to the rehabilitation of Wesley Snipes as a cinematic icon. Snipes' career had a complicated trajectory in the years following Blade 2 for reasons that had more to do with his personal circumstances than his talents. But the Blade trilogy, and Blade 2 specifically, has ensured that a generation of filmmakers and cinema lovers carry a clear sense of what Snipes at his best could do, what his particular combination of physical authority, content, intensity, and moments of genuine emotional rawness was capable of producing. And that awareness has been part of the foundation for his return to public regard, most visibly in recent years, in ways that a lesser film would not have made possible. There is also something to be said about Blade 2's place in the conversation about superhero cinema's origins and evolution, a conversation that has become in recent years considerably more sophisticated than it was in the early days of the current franchise era. It is now fairly widely understood that the Blade films, and particularly the first two, were instrumental in demonstrating to studios that superhero and comic book material could generate serious commercial returns without requiring the kind of all ages softening that had previously been assumed necessary. In this sense, Blade 2 is part of the origin story of the entire modern era of superhero cinema. Not the only part, not the most celebrated part, but a genuine and significant part. And understanding this, understanding that the film is not just an artifact of the early 2000s but a contributing cause of the genre landscape we currently inhabit, gives it a kind of retrospective importance that its original reception did not fully register. Does the film feel timeless or perfectly off its time? This is a question I want to sit with carefully because I think the honest answer is both. In different registers, there are elements of Blade 2 that are unmistakably artifacts of the early 2000s. The CG work, in places, carries the visible limitations of its era. The digital compositing has a quality of ungroundedness that contemporary visual effects work has largely overcome, and there are moments in the film's action sequences where the switch between practical and digital is perceptible in a way that briefly pulls you out of the physical reality that their role is otherwise so committed to establishing. This is not a significant criticism, it is simply the mark of a film that was made at a specific moment in the development of visual effects technology, and it will be immediately recognizable to any viewer who encounters the film for the first time today. Similarly, certain elements of the film's aesthetic, its particular variety of dark industrial cool, its relationship to the music culture of the early 2000s as expressed in its soundtrack choices, have the flavor of their moment in a way that is neither good nor bad, simply specific. The film smells like 2002, like a particular version of urban night, of genre darkness, of a cultural moment that was navigating its anxieties through a very specific aesthetic vocabulary. And yet, and here is the thing I keep returning to, the elements of the film that matter most do not feel dated at all. The creature design still works, not despite its age, but independent of it, because great design has a durability that technical novelty does not. The thematic content, the questions about what it means to be made, about the ethics of alliance, about the relationship between violence and grief, is as alive now as it was in 2002, and arguably more alive because the cultural anxieties it was processing have not diminished in the intervening years, but evolved and in some cases intensified. The performances hold, the cinematography hold, the score holds, the deeper intentions of the film, everything that Del Toro was reaching for, hold completely. A film that holds in its deeper intentions while showing its age in its surfaces is, I would argue, a film that has earned something. It has demonstrated that it was always more than its moment, that it was beneath the very specific style of its era, in conversation with something that transcends era, and that in the final analysis is what I mean when I say that Blade 2 is a film worth taking seriously. Not despite what it is, but because of what it is. Beneath the surface, in the places that matter. From this moment, we go into four spoilers. If you have not yet seen this film, stop here, go experience it first, and come back. Some things deserve to be felt before they are understood. Still here? Good. Then let us go all the way in, because the spoiler territory of Blade 2 is not simply a list of plot revelations. It is a place where everything the film has been quietly building, every thematic thread, every visual motif, every carefully weighted performance beat, finally becomes fully visible. And I want to walk through it slowly because the film's construction in its final act is, I think, one of the most carefully engineered pieces of emotional storytelling in the genre cinema of its era. Nothing here is accidental. Every revelation has been earned by everything that preceded it, and understanding how Del Toro built toward this ending reshapes the experience of the entire film in a way that I find deeply satisfying, the kind of retroactive illumination that the best storytelling produces, where the ending does not simply conclude the story, but transforms your understanding of everything that came before it. Let us begin with the central betrayer. Because the turn at the heart of Blade 2's third act is not, when you examine it closely, a surprise in the conventional sense. It is rather an inevitability that the film has been preparing you for, or more precisely, preparing you against, from its very first scenes. The betrayal I am speaking of is the revelation that Eli Damaskinos, the vampire elder who arranged the alliance with Blade and presented himself as the pragmatic, civilized face of vampire power, is in fact the creator of the Leapers, not a victim of the Reaper threat, its architect, its father. The man who designed in cold blood and with full intention the biological weapon that has been consuming both human and vampire alike. The moment this is revealed, The moment when the alliance is exposed as having been, from the beginning, a manipulation, is filmed with a specific quality of stillness that I want to draw your attention to, because it is a masterclass in how to deliver a revelation without overstating it. Del Toro does not punctuate the moment with a dramatic musical sting. He does not cut rapidly between reaction shots to underline the emotional significance. He simply holds. He lets the camera sit with the information in the same unhurried way that the film has sat with everything else. And the effect of that stillness, that refusal to tell you how to feel, is to make the revelation land with a weight that a more conventionally dramatized moment would not have achieved. You feel it as a physical thing, as a genuine drop in your stomach, because the film has trusted you all along to bring your own emotional intelligence to what you are watching, and now it trusts you to feel this without being conducted toward the feeling. But here is what I find most interesting about this betrayal, the thing that goes beyond the mechanics of the plot turn. Damaskinos did not simply create the Reapers as a weapon in some abstract strategic calculation. He created them as an experiment. And the subject of that experiment, its most significant product, its most direct consequence, was his own son, Jared Nomak. Let that sit for a moment, because the horror of this revelation is not simply that Damaskinos is the villain behind the Reaper threat, it is that he used his own child as the primary test subject for his biological experimentation, that Nomak's condition, his suffering, his unappeasable hunger, his biological alienation from everything that might be called comfort or belonging, was inflicted on him by his own father. That the man who was supposed to be the origin of Nomak's identity, the source of his name and his lineage and whatever claim he had to the structures of the vampire world, was instead the origin of his wound, the person most responsible for his pain. This transforms the entire film in retrospect. Because every scene involving Nomak, every moment where Kosa's performance registers that quality of grief, that sense of carrying something enormous and unearned, now has a specific cause, a specific author. The loneliness in Nomak's physicality, the sense of a creature that moves through the world as though it does not quite belong in any of the spaces it occupies, is the loneliness of a child who was turned into a weapon by the person who was supposed to love him. And that loneliness is not a side effect of his condition. It is, in the most direct possible sense, his condition. He is not lonely because of what he is what he is because of the loneliness that was imposed on him. Think about what this means for the film's thematic conversation about made things. Nomak was not simply made in the gender sense that all of the film's major characters are made, shaped by forces external to themselves, defined by conditions they did not choose. He was made by his own father. His creation was an act of paternal violence, and his existence, his entire painful, consuming, destructive existence, is the consequence of a father's decision to treat his child as material rather than as a person, as a means to an end rather than as an end in himself. This is, if you think about it in the most direct terms, a story about what parental abuse does to a child, not metaphorically, not abstractly. The film is, in its deepest structure, a story about the long, violent, uncontainable consequences of using a child as an instrument of your own purposes. The Reaper played the spreading, consuming, apparently unstoppable destruction that the film has been treating as a kind of natural disaster, as a force of nature, is in fact entirely the product of one person's choices. One person's decision to treat the act of creation as a technical rather than a moral exercise. One person's refusal to take responsibility for what his creation would need and feel and become. And what has that creation become? It has become something that destroys everything it touches. Something that cannot control its own hunger because its hunger is the expression of a wound that was never acknowledged, never addressed, never given any possibility of healing. Something whose violence is not chosen but constitutive, built into it by the very act of its creation. This is the psychology of a child who was hurt in the most fundamental ways, expressed through the vocabulary of biological horror, and once you see it in those terms, the film's horror register deepens significantly, because it is no longer simply the horror of creatures that kill. It is the horror of consequences that no one took responsibility for, the horror of a wound that spreads because it was never treated. Damaskinos himself, and I want to spend a moment with this character because he is in some ways the film's most frightening figure precisely because he is its most controlled one, is written and performed as a particular species of villain that Del Toro returns to in various forms across his work. The villain who believes genuinely and without apparent self-awareness that his purposes justify whatever is done in their service. The villain whose monstrousness is not expressed in excess or passion but in precision. In the cold, careful, architecturally organized imposition of his will on everything within his reach, Damascanus does not raise his voice. He does not threaten. He simply arranges. He is a spider at the center of a web of such long-standing and such careful construction that it has become invisible, that the people moving within it have forgotten they are in a web at all. What makes him genuinely frightening, more frightening I would argue than the reapers whose chaos at least announces itself honestly, is that he represents the organized, institutionalized violence of power, the kind of violence that wears the face of civilization, that conducts itself through elaborate architecture and ancient custom and the language of rationality, that can look at the suffering it has created, can look at his own son's agony, and read it as data rather than feeling it as consequence. This is the most dangerous kind of evil in Del Toro's moral universe, not the violence of the wound, but the violence of the plan. Now let us talk about Scud, about Norman Reedus' character, who functions as one of the film's most emotionally loaded reveals, and one that I think is often not given the attention it deserves, perhaps because it arrives in the context of a more spectacular sequence and can be somewhat overwhelmed by its surroundings. Scud has been throughout the film's first half a source of genuine warmth. His relationship with Blade, the easy, darkly humorous, clearly functional partnership of two people who trust each other in the specific, practical way of people who have worked together under dangerous conditions, is one of the film's primary points of human connection. In a film populated largely by beings who are ancient and violent and operating in registers of relationship that are either formally hierarchical or adversarially defined, Scott and Blade have something that feels genuinely contemporary, genuinely human. They talk to each other like people. They have the rhythms of actual friendship, the shorthand, the low-grade teasing, the easy assumption of mutual regard that does not need to be performed because it does not need to be proved. Which is why the revelation that Scott has been working for Damaskinos from the beginning, that his presence in Blade's world is a deliberate placement, a long-term intelligence operation embedded at the heart of Blade's operation, lands with such genuine force. Not because it is the most narratively significant revelation in the film, but because it is the most personally costly one. Because it takes something the film has allowed you to feel as real and reveals it as constructed. It takes warmth and retroactively makes it strategy. And that retroactive coldness, the sudden realization that the ease you felt in those scenes was being performed for purposes you did not understand, is a very specific kind of painful. What Del Toro does with this revelation in terms of staging is, I think, quietly excellent. He does not dramatize Scud's exposure through confrontation or chase. He dramatizes it through a simple, brutal act of dismissal. Blade deals with the revelation in the most direct way possible, with an economy of response that is both entirely in character and genuinely shocking in its quickness. There is no speech, no accusation, no opportunity for Scott to explain or justify, just the sudden end of something that had been, the film now tells you, never entirely what it appeared to be. And the quickness of that ending, the refusal of the dramatic scene, the denial of the closure that a conventionally dramatized portrayal would have provided, leaves a gap in the film's emotional space that is more disturbing than any extended confrontation could have been. You are left with the loss of the warmth and no scene in which to process it. You have to carry it forward into the film's final act alongside everything else that is happening, and that accumulation of unprocessed feeling is, I think, exactly what Del Toro intended. Now I want to talk about Nissa, about Leonovella's performance in the film's final movement, and specifically about the ending that Del Toro gives her, because I believe it is the most purely beautiful thing in the film, the sequence that most completely realizes what Blade 2 has been reaching for, the sequence that I meant when I said earlier that there is a shot near the end of this film involving light that does something to me I cannot fully articulate. Throughout the film, Nissa has been the figure through whom the possibility of genuine correction across the boundary, across the categories of human and vampire and everything in between, has been most fully explored. Her relationship with Blade develops through the film's middle sections with a quality of restraint that I find deeply affecting. It is not a romance in the conventional sense. It does not follow the grammar of the genre romance, the witty antagonism that softens into attraction, the moment of declared feeling, the conventional resolution. It is something more complicated and more interesting than that. A mutual recognition between two beings who understand something fundamental about each other's isolation, and who find in the specific conditions of their forced alliance a tentative and genuinely felt point of contact. What makes Nissa interesting, what makes her more than simply a love interest or vampire representative, is her intelligence and her integrity. She is not naive about what the Alliance is or what Blade represents. She knows what he is. She knows what he is. She knows what his presence in her world means. And she chooses, with full awareness of those meanings, to engage with him as a person rather than as a category, to see the individual rather than the archetype. This choice, freely made, genuinely costly, maintained in the face of every pressure her world exerts against it, is what makes her death so genuinely terrible. Because Nissa is infected. During the film's third act, in a sequence of events that has the quality of genuine tragedy in the Greek sense, not misfortune, but the inevitable consequence of specific conditions meeting specific characters at a specific moment, she is exposed to the reaper condition and begins to turn. And the film makes a choice at this point that I want to examine carefully, because it is the choice that most clearly demonstrates what kind of film Blade 2 has always been at its deepest level. Rather than treating Nissa's infection as primarily a tactical problem, rather than organizing the film's response to it around the question of whether a cure can be found, or whether she can be saved, or what her infection means for the remaining mission, Del Toro treats it as a human tragedy. He allows the film to slow down in the face of it, to sit with it, to feel it, and crucially, he allows Blade to feel it, to respond to Nissa's condition not as a complication of the mission, but as a personal loss, as the loss of something that mattered. This is, in the context of the action film genre, an almost radical choice. The action hero is not supposed to be stopped by grief. He is supposed to push through it, absorb it, convert it into motivation for the next action sequence. The genre's implicit contract with its audience specifies that emotional pain will be processed quickly and translated into kinetic energy. Del Toro refuses this contract. He insists that Blade's feeling for Nessa be allowed to exist as feeling rather than immediately converted into fuel. And in that insistence, he does something that most action films do not attempt. He makes the hero's grief real in a way that the genre usually forecloses. The final scene between Blade and Nissa, I want to describe this carefully because it is the most emotionally precise sequence in the film and I want to do it justice. Nissa, fully turning, is dying. She is at the threshold. And there is that word again, that recurring concept, that image Del Toro has been building toward all film, between what she was and what the Reaper condition is trying to make her into. And she makes a request. Not for a cure, because there is none. Not for more time, because there is not enough. She asks to see the sunrise. She asks, in the last moments of her life, for the one thing that the vampire condition has always denied her. The one thing that represents, in the most direct possible symbolic terms, the human world she was never permitted to belong to. Think about what that means. The vampire's defining vulnerability, the thing that has always marked the absolute boundary of the vampire's world, the threshold they cannot cross, is sunlight. It is the most ancient, most consistent element of vampire mythology. That which nourishes human life destroys theirs. Nissa, at the end of her life, asks for precisely that. She asks for the thing that will end her on her own terms rather than the Reaper's. She asks to be destroyed by sunlight rather than consumed by the condition that was imposed on her. And Blade gives it to her. He holds her as the sun rises. He takes her into the light. And Del Toro filmed this in a way with that specific quality of warm, open, almost luminous cinematography that I described earlier as the film's visual language for genuine human connection, that transforms what is narratively a moment of destruction into something that reads as a kind of grace. The red that I mentioned earlier, the specific, precisely lit, formally beautiful red that fills this scene, is the red of the sunrise. The first and last sunrise that Nissa will ever see, and Blade holds her through it, and the film holds you through it, and Del Toro gives the scene exactly as much time as it needs, not a frame more, not a frame less. This is the shot I cannot fully articulate. This is the image that stays with me. Not the choreography, not the creature design, not the plot mechanics of the betrayal, though all of those are extraordinary. This, the sunrise, the red, the held stillness of two beings at a threshold that only one of them will cross. Del Toro has been building to this image all film, with every visual choice, every thematic thread, every piece of character work, and when it arrives, it does not feel like a climax, it feels like a resolution, like something returning to where it was always meant to be. I want to talk about what this scene says in the context of the film's larger thematic conversation. Because Nissa's death, the way she chooses it, the way Blade participates in it, is the film's most complete statement about the relationship between violence and love in a world where the two are perpetually entangled. Blade's whole existence is organized around destruction. He destroys the things that threaten the human world because that is what he was made to do, and because that purpose, however violently imposed, has become genuinely his own. He has chosen it, he has owned it. And yet, in the film's final emotional act, the destruction he participates in is not an act of war, but an act of love. He destroys Nissa because she asked him to, because it was what she wanted, because the alternative of letting the Reaper condition take what remained of her would have been a violence of a different kind, the violence of allowing something true to be consumed by something false. This is the distinction the film has been drawing all along, beneath the surface of its genre action, between the violence that serves genuine human purposes, the violence that is chosen, that is in service of something beyond itself, that acknowledges what it costs, and the violence that is simply imposed. The violence of the made thing, directed outward by the will of its creator. Blade's violence in this final act is an act of witness, an act of presence. He does not look away. He does not convert the moment into mission. He stays and feels and allows himself to be changed by what he feels. And that willingness to be changed, to carry the cost of what he does rather than simply performing it, is what makes him, in the end, more than a weapon, more than what he was made to be. The film's actual climax, the confrontation with Damaskinos, is, in some ways, deliberately less emotionally elaborate than the sunrise scene. Del Toro makes a choice here that I think is exactly right, though it is a choice that occasionally leaves viewers slightly unsatisfied. The confrontation with the primary villain is swift, almost perfunctory, dispensed with an economy that refuses the genre's typical appetite for extended final boss theatrics. And I think this is correct because the film has been careful to establish that Damaskinos is not the film's true antagonist in the emotional sense. He is the film's primary institutional villain, the organized power that created and directed the suffering, but the film's emotional antagonism has been with the condition of suffering itself, with the world that produces figures like Nomak and Blade and Nissa, with the structures of power that treat creation as a purely technical exercise. Damascanus is the face of that word, and his swift, unglamorous end is a deliberate refusal to give him the dramatic dignity of a proper climactic confrontation. He is dealt with efficiently as a problem to be solved, and the film moves on to what actually matters, to Nissa, to the sunrise, to the thing that the entire preceding story has been building toward emotionally. But before we reach that final scene, there is the matter of Nomak himself. The confrontation between Blade and Nomak is the film's most physically spectacular sequence, but it is also, and this is what elevates it above spectacle, its most emotionally complex one. Because by the time Blade and Nomak face each other for the last time, the film has done enough work to ensure that this is not simply a fight between a hero and a monster. It is an encounter between two beings who recognize each other, two meet things, two creatures defined by the conditions of their creation rather than the choices of their becoming. Nukos plays the final confrontation with a quality that I find deeply moving, a tiredness beneath the violence, as though Nomak has been carrying his condition for so long that even the act of fighting feels less like aggression than like exhaustion. There is a moment in the sequence where Nomak pauses, where Del Toro holds on Goss's face briefly between the kinetic exchanges, and what you see there is not rage or hunger, but something much quieter and much sadder, a kind of recognition, as though Nomak on some level understands how this ends, as though he has always understood how this ends, as though the ending is not a defeat but a release. And then there is the detail that I think is the film's most extraordinary piece of symbolic storytelling. When Blade kills Nomak, he does not use a weapon, he uses his hands. And specifically, he uses the act of pressing, of finding the specific biological vulnerability in Nomak's design and applying pressure directly to it. This is an intimate form of death, not the distance of a blade or a projectile, but the proximity of touch. And Del Toro films it with that same quality of stillness and closeness that he brings to the film's most emotionally weighted moments, with the camera near enough to read both faces, both bodies, the specific quality of what passes between them in the final moment. What passes between them is not triumph and defeat. It is something more like completion. Nomak's death in this sequence has the quality of something being returned to a state of rest, something that was perpetually in motion, perpetually hungry, perpetually in pain, perpetually the expression of a wound that would not heal, is finally allowed to be still, and Blade, who made that stillness possible, does not celebrate it. He does not register it as victory. He registers it as the terrible, costly, necessary thing it is, a made thing putting an end to another made thing, both of them products of the same fundamental failure of responsibility, both of them in a sense casualties of the same war, the war between what power creates and what it refuses to take care of. There is a detail in the aftermath of Nomak's death that I want to draw your attention to, because it is a small thing but a precise one. Blade does not leave quickly. He stays with what he has done for a moment. He exists in the space of the consequence. This is consistent with everything I have described about his performance throughout the film. The refusal to let the violence pass without registering its cost. But in this specific context, coming immediately before the film's most emotionally devastating scene with Nissa, it functions as a kind of preparation, as though Blade is gathering something, some quality of presence, some capacity for staying with what is difficult that he will need for what comes next. Now, foreshadowing. Because Blade 2 is the kind of film that rewards a second viewing with a generosity that only films built with genuine intention can provide. There are things planted in the film's first half that only become fully visible in retrospect, and I want to walk through several of them because each one deepens the experience of the film as a whole. The most significant piece of foreshadowing is visual rather than narrative. Del Toro plans in a relatively early scene involving Nissa a specific quality of attention, a way of filming her in relation to certain light sources that is subtly different from how he films the other Blood Pack members, where the others are primarily lit in the film's cold, blue-green default register. Nissa receives, in two or three early scenes, a slight warm quality that suggests an openness to human light that the others do not share. At first viewing, this reads simply as characterization, as a visual signal that Nissa is different from her colleagues in her disposition. At second viewing, knowing where the film ends, it reads as prophecy. Del Toro is already in those early scenes, marking Nissa for the sunrise, already in the visual language of the film, pointing her toward the ending that will define her. The relationship between Blade and Whistler, restored in the film's opening and apparently stable throughout its middle section, contains, in retrospect, several small but precise signals of the tension that will become significant later. There are moments in their early scenes together where Whistler's restored presence has a quality of slight unreality, where Snipes plays Blade's response to him with a quality of relief that contains, visible only in retrospect, a note of something not quite resolved. As though Blade has accepted the restoration but not entirely stopped wondering what it cost, what 18 months of being turned did to the man he knew. These moments are small, they are not emphasized, but they are there in the texture of the performances, and they give the Blade Whistler relationship a depth that a less careful film would not have troubled to establish. The repair biology, the specific vulnerability that Blade exploits in the final confrontation with Nomak, is introduced in the film's third act as a newly discovered piece of tactical information. But Del Toro has been leaving visual clues about it throughout the preceding film that function as foreshadowing for attentive viewers. The way the reapers respond to certain environmental conditions, the specific manner in which their feeding mechanics operate, the detail of their cardiovascular system that becomes plot relevant at the climax, all of these are established, at least in outline, in the creature's earlier appearances, not enough to allow a first-time viewer to anticipate the specific tactical application, but enough that on second viewing you can see Del Toro building the architecture of the resolution from the film's earliest creature sequences. The puzzle pieces are there. They are just not assembled until they need to be. The scene in which the blood pack first gears up, the sequence in the armory, early in the film's second act, contains a detail that I have thought about many times since first noticing it. Among the weapons being prepared and calibrated is a very specific piece of equipment that receives a brief, somewhat lingering camera attention that seems, at first viewing, slightly out of proportion to its narrative significance. At second viewing, knowing what that piece of equipment will mean in the film's final act, the linger is revealed as Del Toro establishing something, tagging it almost in the visual memory of the film, so that when it reappears in a crucial context, your body knows it before your mind does. This is the work of a filmmaker who thinks about the entire film simultaneously, who is always, while shooting scene 12, thinking about the experience of scene 43 and making choices in the earlier scene that serves the later one. There is also the matter of what Damascus does not say in his early scenes, the silences and omissions in his initial negotiation with Blade that, in retrospect, are the loudest things in those sequences. He explains the rebirth threat with a precision and a completeness that, on first viewing, registers as the precision of a frightened and desperate figure sharing everything he knows. On second viewing, that same precision registers as the precision of someone sharing exactly what they want you to know and nothing more. Someone whose control of the information is total enough that even his apparent vulnerability is a performance. The truth of Damascus is in what he does not say, and Del Toro characteristically trusts you to find it on the second viewing, or the third, or whenever you decide to look. The film has no post-credit scene in the traditional sense, no explicit setup for the next installment, no character moment appended after the titles. This is a choice that I find entirely right for the kind of film Blade 2 is. A post-credit scene would have converted the film's ending into a setup, would have signaled that what you had just watched was primarily an installment in an ongoing story, rather than a complete artistic experience in itself. Del Toro, who was always making a Guillermo del Toro film first and a franchise entry second, understood that the sunrise needed to be the last image, not a promise of what comes next, but a completion of what just happened, a final frame that the film could rest in, that could hold its meaning without immediately giving way to the next thing. What the ending leaves behind is, I think, the feeling that Blade 2 most wanted to produce, not excitement, not the forward momentum of franchise anticipation, but something quieter and more lasting. A sense of having been in the presence of genuine grief, genuine loss, genuine beauty. A sense that something real was at stake in this story, and that something real was paid for it. The sunrise does not redeem what happened. It does not resolve the tragedy of Nissa's death, or the tragedy of Nomak's existence, or the tragedy of a world organized around power that creates without taking responsibility for what it creates. What it does is witness those things. It offers the beauty of its light to a figure who was denied it her entire life, and it lets that beauty be genuine even in the context of all the darkness that preceded it. This is, I think, what Guillermo del Toro's cinema is always finally about, not the triumph of light over darkness, which would be a comforting lie, but the reality of beauty within darkness, the fact that something can be genuinely beautiful and genuinely terrible at the same time, that a sunrise can be both the most peaceful and the most violent thing in a creature's experience, that love in a world like this one takes the form of holding someone to the thing that ends them and staying with it and not looking away. I've watched the sunrise sequence, as I said, perhaps a dozen times now. Each time it does the same thing to me, not the same emotion exactly. The nature of the feeling shifts slightly with each viewing, colored by whatever else I am carrying when I come to the film, but the same quality of impact, the same sense of something being placed in me that was not there before, something about the relationship between beauty and grief, about what it means to be held in the light by someone who is willing to stay. That is what good cinema does. It does not just tell you things, it does not just show you things, it leaves things in you, things that sit in a specific place and speak occasionally, quietly, when the conditions are right. Blade 2 left that in me. The sunrise, the red, the stillness, the reading, the sunrise, the red, the stillness, and I have been carrying it ever since. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over you after certain films end. Not the silence of emptiness, not the silence of a story that has simply stopped, but a different kind entirely. The silence of something that has genuinely arrived, that has completed itself, that has placed something in the room that was not there before the film began, and that will remain in the room after the credits have finished and the lights have come back up and you have returned to whatever the ordinary world is asking of you. Blade 2 ends in that silence, or at least it does for me, and I want to spend some time now simply being honest about what that means, stepping away from the analytical entirely, as I promised I would, and speaking only as a person who sat with this film and felt it do something real. I want to tell you about the single moment that has not left me. Not the sunrise, though the sunrise is extraordinary and I have described it at length and stand by everything I said. The moment I keep returning to is smaller than that. It is a moment that most discussions of the film, even positive ones, tend to pass over without comment. It is a moment that does not announce itself as significant. It does not occur at a narrative peak or a visual climax. It is simply a pause. It happens in the middle section of the film, in a scene between Blade and Nissa that is primarily functional in its narrative purpose. They are exchanging tactical information, establishing parameters, doing the practical work of people who have agreed to work together and are now actually doing so. And in the middle of this exchange, there is a moment where the conversation stops. Not because something dramatic has happened, not because a revelation has been made or a decision reached. It stops because Nissa simply looks at Blade, and Blade, for a fraction of a second that Del Toro holds just long enough for you to register it, looks back. That is all, a look. A held moment, two beings who have no language for what they might be to each other, in a world that has not given them any framework for the possibility, existing briefly in the same quality of attention, and then the conversation resumes, and the film moves on, and if you blink you miss it entirely. But I did not blink, and that moment, that hale, quiet, frameless instant of mutual regard between two figures who have every reason not to see each other and who, despite all of that, do as the moment that most completely captures what Blade 2 is about. Not the action, not the creature design, not the Natic architecture or the cinematographic intelligence or any of the things I have been discussing for the last several hours. This simple, enormous, utterly ordinary act of one being seeing another. Across every boundary, across every category, across every history of violence and opposition and definition. Just, I see you. I see you. That is what the film keeps saying, in every register, through every layer of its craft. I see you. The made thing sees the other made thing. The border creature sees the other border creature. The being who belongs nowhere looks at the being who belongs nowhere, and for a moment, brief, costly, probably impossible to sustain, they belong somewhere together. Did this film change how I see something? Yes, and I want to be specific about this because I think vague claims of transformative experience are one of the least useful things a film essay can offer. What Blade 2 changed for me was something about the relationship between violence and care, about the way those two things, which we tend to place in opposition, which our culture tends to treat as existing at opposite ends of a spectrum, can in fact coexist, can in fact be aspects of the same gesture. Blade's violence and Blade's care are not in conflict with each other. They are expressions of the same underlying thing, a commitment to something, a refusal to let certain things be destroyed without a cost. The violence and the tenderness are both forms of the same seriousness, the same willingness to be present in the full weight of a situation rather than retreating from it. I knew this abstractly before I saw the film. As an idea, it is not particularly surprising. What the film did was make me feel it, put it in my body rather than just my head. And that shift from knowing something intellectually to feeling it as a physical reality is the specific thing that cinema, at its best, can do that no other art form quite replicates. It is the thing that keeps me coming back to the dark, to the screen, to the experience of sitting with a story and letting it do whatever it needs to do to me. Would I return to Bleeds too? I already have, many times, and I expect I will again for reasons that shift slightly with each return. Sometimes I come back for the visual pleasure of it, for the specific experience of being in Del Toro's color world, of letting that palette work on me. Sometimes I come back for Lucas because his performance is one of those rare things that reveals new dimensions on repeated viewing, small decisions that you did not catch the first time, inflections in a line reading that carry meaning you were not yet prepared to receive. Sometimes I come back simply because I want to be in the presence of the film's intelligence, of something that was thinking as hard as it could within the constraints it was given about things that matter. And sometimes this is the honest answer, the one I am least likely to offer in a more formal critical context. I come back because I want to feel the sunrise again, because I want to be in that red light, holding that held moment, existing briefly in the space of that particular beauty and that particular grief, because whatever it costs to feel something that real, it is worth paying, again and again and again. What kind of person will carry this film with them? I have thought about this question carefully because I think the answer is more specific than simply film lovers or action fans or Del Toro devotees, though it includes all of those. The person who will carry Blade 2 is someone who knows what it is to exist in the border space, to be defined by something you did not choose, to be neither one thing nor another, and to have found in that condition not resolution but a kind of difficult, costly, genuine life. This film is for people who understand that belonging is not a given, and that connection, when it happens across every reason it should not, is among the most precious things this world contains. It is for people who are willing to let a genre film mean something, who do not need the rapper to be prestigious in order to take the content seriously, who can look at a vampire action sequel and see in it a conversation about creation and responsibility and grief and love that is as real as anything in a more celebrated register of cinema. It is for people who have sat with something terrible and found it beautiful, and who know that those two things can be true at the same time without cancelling each other out. Now, let me give you the complete experience, the full picture, the honest reckoning with what this film is in total and what it deserves from you. Blade T is a film of genuine and significant artistic ambition, operating within the commercial structure of a studio franchise sequel that achieves more than it was required to achieve, and in doing so demonstrates quietly, without self congratulation, simply through the work itself, that genre cinema is not a lesser form, that the constraints of a franchise and a genre and a budget and a release window are not necessarily enemies of artistic intention, that a filmmaker of real vision can find within those constraints enough room to do something true. What it achieves is considerable. It achieves creature design of genuine artistic distinction. It achieves performances from Snipes, from Goss, from Varel, from Berman that go beyond what the genre required, and in some cases go beyond what the genre typically allows. It achieves cinematography that uses color and light as emotional language rather than simply as visual style. It achieves a score that understands when to speak and when to be silent. It achieves thematic depth, a genuine conversation about creation and responsibility and the ethics of necessary violence that persists long after the action sequences have faded from memory. And it achieves in its final sequence a moment of genuine beauty and genuine grief that is among the most purely moving things in the action cinema of its era. Its weaknesses are real but not ruinous. The ensemble is underdeveloped in places where it could have been extraordinary. The pacing has specific sections that would benefit from a sharper editorial hand. The CG in places carries the visible limitations of its production moment. These are genuine imperfections in a genuinely imperfect film. And the imperfections, as I said earlier, are almost always the mark of ambition. The places where the reaching exceeded the grasp, which is always preferable to the alternative. Who will love this most deeply? Viewers who bring patience as well as appetite, who are willing to let the film be slower and stranger and more emotionally demanding than the trailer suggested, who find Del Toro's particular visual and thematic world congenial, who respond to his fascination with the biological and the mythological and the morally complicated, who can watch Wesley Snipes and see, beneath the iconic surface, a genuinely considered performance, who are willing to mourn a monster, who may not connect with it. Viewers who came primarily for the kinetic energy of the first Blade film and find Del Toro's more meditative passages an interruption rather than a deepening. Viewers for whom the CG limitations of the early 2000s are a significant barrier to immersion. Viewers who need their genre film to stay within its genre lane and who experience Del Toro's thematic ambitions as an intrusion rather than an enrichment. These are not wrong responses, they are simply different relationships to what a film like this asks of you. Should you watch this in cinema, on streaming, or own it? My honest answer is own it. This is a film that rewards the kind of attention that streaming's algorithmic, interrupted, distracted context does not always encourage. It deserves a screen as large as you can manage, sound as good as you have access to, and the commitment of genuine undivided time. It deserves to be encountered as a complete experience rather than as background. Because what it does, the way it accumulates meaning through its visual and musical language, the way its emotional architecture depends on your sustained presence, requires you to meet it halfway, and when you do, it gives you back considerably more than halfway in return. The rating 7.1 out of 10. I want to earn this number honestly because a number without earning is just noise. 7.1 is not a hesitant positive. It is not a diplomatic compromise between what I feel and what I think the critical consensus expects of me. It is a specific, considered, genuine assessment of a specific, considered, genuine film. It reflects a film that achieves at its best something that I would describe as genuinely great. Moments and sequences and ideas that are not simply good but extraordinary, that operate at a level of ambition and execution that deserves the highest recognition. And it reflects simultaneously a film whose imperfections are real enough that those heights are not sustained with total consistency across its full running time. A 7.1 is a film I return to, a film I think about, a film that has left something in me that has not faded, a film I believe in and will recommend to anyone who asks. 7.1 is earned, every decimal of it. And the one true sentence that earns it, this is a film that understood before most genre cinema did that the monster deserves a witness, and that gave one without flinching, right up to and including the last red light of morning. Now let me close this the way I always want to close, not with summary, not with a list of conclusions, but with the thought that feels most true and most necessary at the end of this particular journey. What Blade 2 finally understands, what it has always understood in the quiet beneath all the noise, is that beauty and violence are not opposites, that grief and grace are not opposites, that a thing can be made for destruction and choose, in the space between one moment and the next, to become something else, something that holds rather than releases, something that stays rather than moves on, something that looks at the light rather than away from it. That is a rare thing for a film to understand, rarer still to make you feel it in your body rather than your mind, and rarest of all to express it through the language of a franchise action sequel about how vampire hunters fighting evolved monster creatures in a gothic European city at the turn of the millennium. Cinema rarely does this. Blade 2 does, and that is more than enough. That is everything. Now, before I let you go, and I mean this with real warmth, the kind that does not need performance, thank you. Thank you for spending this much time with me inside this film, for giving it your attention, which is the most valuable thing any of us has to offer anything. If you have made it this far, you are exactly the kind of person the Cineflux exists for. Someone who wants to feel cinema rather than just watch it. Someone who is willing to sit in the dark long enough for something real to happen. If this essay gave you something, a new way of seeing this film, or a reason to see it for the first time, or simply the pleasure of spending time with someone who loves this medium as much as you do, then please leave a comment below. Tell me what you think. Tell me whether you agree about Nisa, about Nomak, about the sunrise. Tell me whether you see something in this film that I missed. Tell me whether the 7.1 feels right to you, or whether you would place it somewhere else on the scale, and why. I read every comment, not as a performance of the accessibility, but because the conversation is genuinely the thing. Because a film essay without the response it generates is only half of what it could be, and your thoughts complete it. A few things I would love to hear from you specifically. First, which performance in this film do you think is most underappreciated? And I have my answer, which I have shared at length, but I am genuinely curious whether yours is different. Second, where does Blade 2 sit for you in Del Toro's filmography? Is it the entry point, the outlier, the undersung masterpiece? Third, is there a film in the same register as this one? Genre cinema with genuine artistic ambition, operating in the space between entertainment and something more that you think deserves this kind of attention and that you would like to see explored on this channel. Those questions are not rhetorical, they are an invitation. The comment section is the extension of this conversation, and I hope you will join it. If you have not yet subscribed to the Cineflux, please do, not as a transaction but as a statement of intention. A declaration that this is the kind of cinema conversation you want in your life, the kind that takes its time, the kind that believes that every frame is a brushstroke, and that the painting is worth looking at closely, and that you are worth the effort of looking closely, and that you are worth the effort of looking closely alongside. We will be back soon. The next essay is coming, and I promise you it will be worth the wait. We are going somewhere unexpected, somewhere that will ask something of you, as this one has, and give something back in return, as this one has tried to. Cinema has no shortage of places worth going, and as long as you are willing to go there with me, the Cineflux will keep finding them. That is the Cineflux. I will see you in the next one.